Dungeon 42. By S. Jackson. Chapter 61. Upstairs. With agony gone, my usual routine reasserted itself. I went back to playing with my layout and getting my layers into a better state as I expanded them. After a week, though, I felt a kind of itch. I'd bought a few surface tiles every other day and had a respectable amount of land to my name. Despite that, I couldn't exactly say I'd done much that was useful with it. The set dressing I'd added was nice, but it didn't really provide much strategic value. Considering my options, I decided to focus on surface tiles for the rest of the month. Thanks to the layout of the valley, it wasn't hard to buy a relatively straight line up the center to the entrance of the natural stone maze. That probably wouldn't look useful to an outside observer, but I considered it a security system of sorts. The moment anything set foot on a tile I owned, I'd be aware of it. I couldn't say if adventurers would realize the same thing in turn, but I wasn't concerned. Having a couple hours of lead time on any potential hostile parties was worthwhile in my book. I didn't stop with that line of tiles, however. Instead, I expanded out from it to engulf the land slowly. An advanced warning was nice, but if I was going to buy that much, I might as well own the valley outright. No sense in leaving massive blind spots they could wander into easily. That I was having a ball playing with the environment was entirely beside the point. Thankfully Alim was game to buy me whatever I wanted since he'd departed from his mother's and was in the fief's capital after 2 weeks. So I had building supplies and everything else my weird little brain could think to covet in short order. While I was busy leveling a lot of land, I recalled that I'd forgotten to amend my standing order. Since Alim had had access to much in the way of variety before, I'd held off on asking for certain things. An oversight on my part. Hi Alim. Please buy any and all art supplies you come across. One of every color, if it's paint or other pigments, you know the drill. Thanks. 42. Once the text was sent, I got back to my project. I had a vague notion of how the Romans built their roads with layers and suspicion about how that might apply to a building foundation. This was definitely an experiment for my own amusement. The process was simple in a and now labor for hours in the hot sun way. I depressed an area slightly larger than I needed and filled it with gravel. I didn't have to pack it down manually, thankfully. It seemed like the system could detect what I wanted and supplied it as desired. On top of that went a solid stone slab that I'd carved to look like a fieldstone foundation if you weren't looking too closely. If it were real, someone would have had to spend an obsessive amount of time getting the stones to fit so perfectly. Once that was done, I started playing with chalk to design a layout. Mistress 42. I'll make sure to keep a lookout for the requested items. Did you wish for me to stay in the capital a while longer, or should I return home? Though I spoke with the village headman about your plan, I cannot confirm if he'd enacted it yet. Your servant. Alim Gray. Alim's reply gave me a jarring reminder that I had a larger scheme in the works. It was easy to forget about the fake quarantine that was supposed to happen soon. Out of sight, out of mind, as it were. Rest up until the end of the week, then head back. I don't distrust them, but I'd feel better if you supervised the initial stage and could report to me. -42. I wrote back after a few moments of consideration. I had planned other things that could help the village out, but I couldn't enact them myself. Not that Alim couldn't simply head back to the capital or possibly a significant port if I really needed something afterward. Alim would need time to move his family once his business with the village was done, but it wouldn't be a problem for me. Not one worth being concerned over anyway. At worst, I'd have to wait a couple weeks for him to have access to better markets when he went to survey his grandfather's estate. With the more serious business dealt with, I got to work putting up the actual house on the foundation. It wasn't too time-consuming a process thanks to how I could manipulate my materials and didn't have to actually bother with lifting things unless I felt like it. In short order, I had what I felt like was a lovely 2-story farmhouse. The kind that looked like it would belong in a picture book. It took me 3 tries to get the structure correct so that the top level didn't sag in odd spots. Apparently, architect and engineer had not been former professions of mine. Thankfully I could make beams as sturdy as needed and eventually hit on the correct formula for spacing. Though I didn't have a genuine reason for it, I was enjoying my dollhouse-like farm. Just to really drive home its nature, I added a chicken coop and animal shelters. Then, messing with the ecology a touch, I increased the density of the grass growing in the sections I owned. Finally, into the newly lush pasture, I added in some sheep, chickens, and horses from samples Alim graciously borrowed at some point. The only thing that was really missing by the end of the month were occupants. The place had a very eerie, suddenly abandoned feeling to it. Like the owner had just gotten up and walked away for no apparent reason. Unfortunately, that wasn't something I could easily remedy myself. Adding a true lived-in feeling would just make it weirder in the end. So, deciding to split the difference, I sent a mass text to the skeletons asking if anyone wanted to play the caretaker. Of course, a skeleton wouldn't use it the same way a living being would, but it would be better than leaving it stand vacant. It wasn't long before I had a horde of curious skeletons turning up to take a look at my efforts. They couldn't accidentally wander outside of the borders of the dungeon, even above ground. Now that the area they could explore had been expanded, they seemed excited. I felt a little bad that I hadn't thought of them while I was working. I still made a point of checking in on them but hadn't considered that they might find what I was doing interesting. So, what do you think? I asked Dawn. She'd been looking the house over thoroughly from the moment she'd arrived. This is a mansion for a noble? Dawn asked. I felt my orbs flicker. No. What gave you that impression? I asked, flatly confused. It was 2 stories but only 3 bedrooms. Really, I'd designed it with Alim and his family in mind, though I wasn't going to admit it. I wasn't about to ask him to come live in the valley. He didn't have a reason to, and it would make him less useful. That didn't stop me decorating one of the rooms with a little girl in mind, though. An inn then? I've never seen such an odd place, Dawn offered with a shrug. What's odd about it? I asked, still not understanding what the issue was. Well, it has many chambers and, that weird space. Like a tunnel but not, Dawn explained. Hold on, you think private rooms in a hallway are strange? I asked though it was clear she did. I wasn't asking because I didn't get that, but because I couldn't think of a more coherent way to form my actual question. I grew up in a single-room home as a child. I think the richest man in our town had 2 rooms, Dawn offered. I almost said something but paused. It was easy to forget sometimes that design features I took for granted weren't actually common. At least not in the context of history. That wasn't even factoring in cultural differences. Right. Well, I was just trying to make a farm for a single family. That building over there is supposed to be a worker's bunkhouse. Which I now realize might be overbuilt, I offered. I'd made it like a dorm with small rooms in it. Tiny rooms by my standards, if I were honest. I was really going to need to text Alim and find out what was expected for houses locally. I apparently knew jack shit on the subject, which could prove a problem depending on what I was trying to do. Chapter 62. Progress. While pondering how to approach the farm and its possible redesign, I assessed my dungeon layout. If I wasn't horribly off the mark, I had a reasonable level of defenses in place to stop a low-level hero party. I did some looking in my encyclopedia to try and make sure I wasn't too far off the mark about that. When it didn't offer much in the way of helpful advice, I tried my manual. Thus far, it hadn't been too useful the few times I schemed it. I did a bit of a rushed job on my everyday work and decided to read it thoroughly. I knew on a certain level that it was something I should have done already. The only issue was that it honestly had been annoying. The text wasn't well composed, the topics out of order, and the font on the eye-gouging side. It only took a few minutes to find something weird. The table of contents hadn't changed, but the interior sections were longer and featured out-of-order entries. Some of them related to the chapter's content. Others did not. There was still no index, and I felt a powerful desire to redo the layout. Edit text? Y/N. I hit yes and found myself in a PDF-style editor. My first move was to unify the font into something soothing. I gave a sigh of relief as my task suddenly felt much more doable. I made sure to save my progress at that moment. Saving often saved sanity in the event of data loss. Not that I was sure how that would even work in this case. Despite that, I used it since it was an option. Thinking too hard about the system was just asking for a stress headache. Editing a book was not a fast process. The most straightforward bit was finding the out-of-place blocks of text. I copy-pasted them into their own chapter that I titled it WTF. I didn't need to try and be clever since it would be for my eyes only. A knock on my chamber's door broke me out of my project. I went to the antechamber and found Henry waiting, which perked me up. He was the skeleton I enjoyed spending time with the most, though Dawn was a close second. Chris was the one I spent the most time with, but that was more of keeping an eye on an annoying kid brother than friendship. "Hey, come on in," I said, gesturing for Henry to enter. "Thank you, me mistress," Henry said and gave one of his customary bows. "You can just call me 42, I offered. Henry straightened up quickly, looking startled. "Unless you don't want to," I added. I hadn't given it much thought, but the suggestions might have been overly familiar. Like architecture and holidays, there could be a lot of differences between what was normal for me and what was typical for Henry. "I'dbh honored," Henry said quickly, stumbling over his words. I nodded in acceptance instead of questioning if he was really okay with it. If he wasn't, then he'd probably keep calling me mistress, and I'd just not bring it up again. "You came at an interesting moment. Care to test out one of my experiments?" I asked, feeling mischievous. Henry seemed wrong-footed for a moment, then nodded. I gestured toward the couch that now replaced the stone bench that had formerly stood in my chamber of machinations. Alim had come across some small samples of naturally fire-resistant monster materials in the fief's market, and I'd refined them to the point where they could withstand the hounds. My plans to make legitimate furniture despite not being able to feel any of it were back on track. Henry obliged, sitting and sinking slightly into the squishy cushions. "I'm not sure what to say. It's more ff for, form-fitting a seat, b but I can't feel it," Henry said after a few moments of shuffling. I felt my orbs flicker, then smacked a hand to my face. The skeletons had more of a tactile sense than I did, but not a lot. "Right, this is a fish bicycle kind of thing," I said, feeling like an idiot. The hounds liked it plenty, but I'd made them big pillow beds already. They also wouldn't care what I made my furniture out of so long as they could clamber all over it. "By bicycle?" Henry asked, tilting his head. "It's a kind of." I paused. There wasn't an easy way to explain one, at least the visual aspect anyway. So instead, I drew one, and a person using it then showed Henry the picture. "It's a simple machine to get places more quickly than walking. The saying means to make something useful but not for the person in question," I explained. Henry nodded, but he was still looking at my drawing as if trying to figure something out. "Did you have a question?" I asked. "Could I have a C copy of this?" "I find the mechanism interesting," Henry said. I was a little surprised but nodded. I added a larger, more detailed drawing of the gear and chain then and copied it onto paper. It was a pretty good technical drawing technique-wise. That I only had a cursory knowledge of what everything should look like would be evident to someone from my own world. I kept that to myself. "So, did you want to hang out, or is the visit because of work?" I asked, trying to get us back on some kind of track. "I've forgotten," Henry said, sounding embarrassed. I'd have smiled if I had a mouth. "Hanging out it is," I chirped. I offered Henry a chaos beverage, then sat opposite him on the couch. That was when the fact that my chamber of machinations wasn't really great for having guests unprepared to entertain themselves occurred to me. Chris usually brought a book or annoyed me to supply himself with fun while I tried to work. Conversely, Henry wasn't rude, and it behooved me to either make small talk or provide an activity. A simple task for someone who wasn't me. I could bend reality to my will within my domain, summon terrifying monsters, and fill adventures with dread, but I sat still, completely flummoxed by simple social interaction. I wasn't the best in that department, but drawing an utter blank was new. Especially since I usually got along with and enjoyed talking to Henry. That we were generally in the company of at least a few other members of the Bone Brigade occurred to me, but it shouldn't have mattered. Us being alone didn't change anything, or at least it shouldn't have. Thankfully, Henry took out an embroidery hoop from his hip pouch and started working on a project. It was a neat combination of thread and beadwork on a fine net I'd refined. Though Henry was entertaining himself, it felt like a total cop-out to not even try talking. And I ransacked my brain for a topic. I was going to say something, come hell or high water. You know, where I'm from, they have a technique for that, using a special kind of needle. It's called tambour, I think, I said. I could vaguely recall how it worked, though I doubted I'd had much personal experience with it. Not going by the amount of knowledge I had about it anyway. That I'd managed to say almost nothing despite the number of words I'd uttered filled me with self-loathing. Care to show me? Henry inquired. I nodded, then realized what I'd done. I was not prepared for a demonstration on any level. Despite that, I immediately kit-bashed a set of the special needles. They had a hook instead of an enclosed eye and ended in handles. The technique worked by poking through the fabric, catching the thread, and pulling a loop up through the last loop. Not wanting to ruin Henry's work, I also summoned a new embroidery hoop and other supplies. My suspicion about my knowledge was on point. I made a mess several times before getting anything going. So, either Henry was exceptionally patient or good at hiding his annoyance. Despite knowing I was flailing in front of an actual artisan of the craft, I kept trying. For reasons I couldn't articulate, even with a gun to my head, I couldn't give up. The end result was garbage, but I had a line of uneven stitches and a couple of beads sewn on before long. Then, and only then, was I able to stop. I basically threw the supplies to Henry like they were burning my hands. I definitely wasn't a fashion major, I muttered, looking at the mess I'd made. I fully expected Henry to tell me A for effort and file this incident under, and we shall never speak of this again. Henry hesitated, clearly surprised, then nodded. With care, he straightened the supplies out and tightened the fabric on the hoop without looking at me. Once he was satisfied with everything, he took up the needle. I didn't watch as Henry got started. My embarrassment had deepened substantially at how gracefully he held the needle by comparison. It wasn't like I prided myself on sewing skills, but I felt like I'd made a total ass of myself for essentially no reason. Getting back to my project, it wasn't long before I was done organizing things. I could have done a speed run and reread the manual, but my focus was shaken. So instead of forcing the matter, I put it on hold and went to the next item on my ever-growing to-do. Since I was nearing a point where I felt comfortable with trying to lure in some low-level adventures, it was time I sent out some invitations. Handmade ones because I was a classy dungeon core. I took some parchment and quickly made a low-detail copy of the local area onto it. Next, I added a blush of color by lowering the opacity on a layer of ink. The cherry on top was a classic red X at the back of the valley where the dungeon would appear to begin. Hi Alim. If you don't mind, try sending some low-level adventurers my way. Some around your level or lower, please. Not looking for paragons of virtue, but not outright evil if possible. Including a small light magic stone to use if you need to sell them, that there is loot to be had. If you can't find anyone or it's inconvenient, don't worry about it. -42. I sent the message, then felt myself go rigid as I realized what I'd done. I'd just casually asked Alim to send people to their deaths. Shit. That was definitely not how I should have phrased it. Something wrong, 42? Henry asked. I realized that I'd sat up rather abruptly in surprise. Not wrong, but I just asked Alim to do something. I could have worded it better, I said, not wanting to explain even as I did. I split the difference and did it poorly instead. What did you say, if I may know? Henry asked. Instead of repeating the message, I just showed him. Why, you have a unique style of writing, Henry commented dryly. I wondered if that was a dig at my diction or the font. It was an approximation of my handwriting, which meant it was more orderly but only just shy of illegible. I doubt he'll take offense. You allowed him to choose if he will or not, Henry added. Just saying. I said, scrubbing my hair or at least running my hand through it. What the misty mass was doing at any given time was a bit of a mystery. I didn't bother with a mirror, so I had little idea what it looked like unless it drifted in front of my face. Trying to avoid eye contact, I found myself accidentally looking at the embroidery hoop Henry was holding. He'd filled in a surprising amount of it. You've been busy, I said in surprise. It's a lovely method, Henry said appreciatively. I got the distinct impression he'd have been smiling if he had the soft tissue to form one. You did that with what I showed you? I asked in genuine surprise. I looked down at Henry's work next to mine, then back up at him. If he'd figured out how to use it so fluidly from my piss-poor example, then it was a Christmas miracle. Henry chuckled, then started embroidering again. He laid down a careful line of stitches at about half his average speed. After letting me see that, he picked up his pace. Henry was fast even when he had to pull the thread all the way through. With this technique, he was going like a sewing machine. Even when he added beads, he was still far faster than I'd ever have expected. Oh! I said, at a loss for actual words. As I said, it's lovely, Henry said with a laugh. I hope you'll show me whatever you make with it, I said, genuinely curious. I liked the things he made and wanted to see what Henry could do with the technique. As you wish, Henry said, then flinched. I laughed and gave him a pat on the shoulder. He'd been doing pretty well in avoiding that phrase up till now. That was when I realized that my tail had been misbehaving and tangled with Henry's legs. Fuck. Since when did that happen? Chapter 63. Deserving Souls. Hi Alim. If you don't mind, try sending some low-level adventurers my way. Some around your level or lower, please. Not looking for paragons of virtue, but not outright evil if possible. Including a small light magic stone to use if you need to sell them, that there is loot to be had. If you can't find anyone or it's inconvenient, don't worry about it. -42. Alim sipped a weak ale and considered 42's message for a while. It was at times easy to forget who he worked for and what exactly she was. The message was a rather harsh reminder. Being a glorified errand boy had suited Alim fine, but he couldn't pretend it would ever be enough to repay his debt. Despite that, 42 wasn't insisting, just asking. He couldn't decide if that was worse or not. Alim was thankful 42 hadn't sent the message until he was already away from home. If he'd gotten it back in Selton, his mother would have been able to smell the worry oozing from him. In a random inn among a sea of strangers, he could contemplate the request without having to worry about worrying her. Your mood's getting heavy, Tiller observed Riley from beside him. She'd gone with him to settle the money with Raston and Corey's families, then on to the capital. Alim hadn't minded the company, though it occasionally made things tricky. Tiller, sorry, Alim sighed into his cup. He needed to get used to thinking of her properly as Charlotte, but it wasn't an easy transition, unlike finding out she was a woman. He'd served plenty of times with ladies who both did and didn't choose to hide it. The Earl had no rules against it, and Alim himself didn't care much. You can call me Tiller. It's not like I mind, Tiller replied amiably. Alim nodded, thankful she wasn't upset with him. Of course, common names didn't carry power, but that didn't mean anyone liked being called wrongly. Honestly, I've been Tiller so long it's easier to hear than Charlotte. That name makes me think of home, and I'd rather not, Tiller added. Alim chewed on that for a few moments. He'd noticed a certain reluctance on her part to talk about her family and respected it. Things happened, and people didn't always want to discuss them. Much like how Alim wouldn't have appreciated Tiller asking after Bess's mother. June was long laid to rest, but the memory was still a wound best left untouched. Tiller didn't press for Alim to speak further, drinking and letting a comfortable silence persist. Like not asking questions, Tiller tended to silence, and when they'd first met, it had given her a cold air. Now Alim recognized that she simply didn't see silence as a void to fill with empty chatter at all costs. Instead, she was comfortable with it and keeping her own counsel. I got a letter from my employer. She's going to have me busy soon, Alim said, trying to brush off his discomfort. Even if he didn't do as 42 asked or couldn't, he was going to go back to Selton soon. Tiller had done a lot during the few days she'd stayed with his family to help Bess. It hadn't exactly pinned down what her ability was, because it was different from Tiller's, but Alim understood it better. That was more than he'd expected, and he'd have appreciated the effort alone. Well, it was bound to happen. I'll still help Bess if you want. I'm not sure what more I can do, but I'm happy to try anyway, Tiller said, looking uncertain but determined. Think you can teach that bird of yours to keep its mouth clean first? Alim asked with a raised brow. He still wasn't happy with Storm's foul mouth. That the bird also tended to express itself by shitting with startling precision on anything it objected to had not helped his opinion of it. Trust me, I would if I could, and I've tried more than once. I'll keep him away from Bess so he can't teach her more, Tiller replied, looking contrite. Alim couldn't help but chuckle and give away the joke. He didn't like that Bess had picked up Bastard, but he didn't blame Tiller. Neither one of them had realized Bess could outright speak to some creatures. I'd gladly take you up on it, but I'm moving my family out of Selton before I get to work. I'm taking them back to some land my grandfather owned, so we'll be parting ways, Alim explained. Fair, Tiller said. She looked like she had more to say, but pursed her lips and set her drink down instead. Alim felt an uneasy feeling settle into his guts. I'm gonna get dinner while it's still lukewarm and terrible, Tiller said, giving a thin smile. Then she darted off into the common room's crowd. Alim couldn't help a rueful smile. He'd like to keep her around, but his life was too much a mess, and he couldn't be honest about why. Alim considered switching to something harder than ale. He wasn't in the mood to think anymore, and the stuff wouldn't do a thing to dull his thoughts. Then, as he was about to raise a hand to get the barkeep's attention, he felt a prickling at the back of his neck. Turning around on instinct, Alim watched as a group came in. 3 ladies and a man who looked a bit younger than him. Nothing special until he noticed the fancy clothes and bits of armor. They were probably adventurers and likely the type with more coin than sense, going by how clean they looked. Just the sort of people 42 would likely find suitable for a trip down into her dungeon. Alim flinched at the thought. He felt instinctive guilt though he intended them no harm. What he couldn't place was why his stomach was roiling, and the hairs on the back of his neck were standing up. Alim took his discomfort as a sign that it would be a good idea to change inns. He settled his and Tiller's tab quickly, then scanned the room for her. He felt his stomach drop out when he saw her and had to watch the group giving him a bad feeling join her at her table. It wasn't unusual to share with strangers. You found seats as you could, and Tiller's table was the only one with enough seats to let them sit together. Alim's first instinct was to dash over and pull her away, fight the lot of them if he had to. Something about the group made them feel like a threat to Tiller specifically. Alim forced himself to take a breath. He wasn't quick to violence, though it wouldn't be wrong to say he had a temper. His father had spent a good part of his youth teaching him not to let it get the better of him. A lesson he'd taken to heart, even if it had taken a while to penetrate his skull. Looking at the group objectively, he felt they all had some heroic classes. Not solely, and none were higher level in that respect than him. Plenty of swagger, not much skill, and gear that looked nice, but not that sturdy. He could take any one of them easily, but he didn't feel like his odds were good against two or more. Since becoming a fighter, Alim learned to trust the changes the class brought. Not simply that, but to untangle and identify the feelings and instincts it imparted from more mundane intuition. This didn't feel like Alim's class warning him of danger. He'd been around plenty of people stronger than him and not felt anything even half as alarming as he was when he looked at the group. The fact he felt the threat was explicitly to Tiller was also odd. Considering the possibilities, Alim started moving through the crowd, taking a seat closer to the group while he continued to study them. He'd been trying to learn to use his special ability Mega Size, but it didn't come easy. It took a few minutes before he finally felt something shift subtly as the world shimmered before settling. Nothing much seemed different at first. The inn was hardly a ley line or a spirit's glen. A few dull gleams of magic items could be seen among the other patrons, but that was it. So when Alim cautiously shifted his glance back to the group sitting with Tiller, he couldn't help a shiver. All four of the group of strangers had black tendrils of viscous magic leading from their chests to the man's sword. Alim wanted to gag. As if seeing could somehow inform his sense of taste and smell. It filled his mouth and nose with something like the bouquet of a trash heap doused in perfume left to rot in the midday sun. It was cloying, gross, but with notes of something familiar and pleasant that rendered it all the more terrible. Alim had no idea what the magic was. He just knew it was hungry and reacting to Tiller somehow. He made sure he caught her eye and signaled for the door. She gave a discreet nod in reply. "If you'll all excuse me," Tiller said politely as she stood. They'd all sat down to eat together, but she was the only one who'd made any headway with her meal. She had joked about the quality, but she tucked in without complaint. "Service to the Earl taught you basic tactics, just how many blisters a human foot could have at once, and anything was better than rations." "Hey, Reiner was still talking to you," the redhead whined as she stood. Alim's relief that Tiller was about to leave evaporated. He could take the woman, but Tiller couldn't, especially since she didn't seem to feel like she needed to be on guard yet. Not an unfair assessment, given how silly the redhead seemed without the benefit of his class's insight. Despite not wanting to tangle with the group, Alim stood up and moved to intercept. Tiller saw him and though she was confused, took his signal and moved toward him. It looked like they were just brushing past each other. That Alim was in a bit of a hurry and not looking where he was going. The redhead clearly wasn't expecting it and the punch she was throwing at Tiller's back connected with Alim's chest. A faint blue aura surrounded the woman for a moment before she threw it and collected in her striking hand. Alim was rocked back a step but not hurt. Tiller would have been. "That ain't exactly friendly, miss," Alim said, clutching his chest in exaggerated pain and looking confused. He didn't make a move to retaliate. His goal was to block the woman and give Tiller time to make good her escape. If he was lucky, it wouldn't come to a fight. "Oh, sorry." The redhead looked utterly shocked. Sorry even, despite the fact she was about to sucker punch someone a moment before. "You pack quite the wallop," Alim added. That wasn't a lie, it hadn't done him any actual harm, but it stung. The woman looked pleased for a moment then flinched, the tendril attached to her darkening. "I'm sorry, that wasn't very ladylike of me," the redhead said suddenly, rushing to sit back down. Alim blinked, confused by the sudden change in personality. She'd seemed like a cagey hothead, but now she was sitting primly. Not his problem and a bit of a blessing since she'd gone and sat down. Alim wanted to take the opportunity and make his own escape but found the man standing up. He was slightly built, but strong through his chest. He looked fast, but he was carrying the wrong kind of sword for his build, which was odd. His eyes also glowed faintly yellow for a moment as he looked Alim over. "I'm Reiner of Stromhold, and you've got something magic on you," Reiner said as if that explained everything. Alim looked at him, waiting for something to follow. It took a moment, but there was an odd undulation in the tendrils of magic, and the man seemed to shake himself awake. "Sorry, a special ability of mine. Not trying to be rude, mister. I'd just like an opportunity to buy the item from you." "If you're selling," Reiner said, looking more focused than before. "It's not for sale," Alim started. 42 had given him the lightstone for a reason, and he wasn't going to sell it even if he didn't do as she asked. That would have been bad faith in his book. Reiner nodded, not seeming surprised. Few people that had magic items would sell them. Those that did usually did it through a church, instead of on the street. All of Alim's good intentions went out the window as he watched Reiner's attention drift. His eyes were following Tiller, and Alim felt the magic from the other man's sword start to react again. Horrifyingly, the woman at the table also responded, their gazes drifting in the same direction. Tiller wasn't safe yet. "There's a bit of a story to it, but you all look like the sort of people I'm looking for," Alim said quickly. Alim looked the group over again and pretended to notice for the first time that one of them was a cleric. He couldn't figure out the god, but didn't care and sketched a very polite salute, hand going to his heart as he bowed shallowly. "What sort of people would that be?" the raven-haired woman asked. It was the first time she'd spoken, and Alim found she had an odd but not unpleasant accent. Her words came out more precisely but not sharp. "Well, forgive the presumption, but I took you for adventures," Alim said, plastering on a nervous expression. That it wasn't the least bit untrue to his feelings lent it authenticity. "You're half right. Reiner is a hero, and we're his party," the redhead said, another flash of temper and pride that went out like a snuffed candle in the next instant. "Hero? Well, I wouldn't bother a hero with my family's troubles," Alim said, wishing he had a hat to crush in his hands. Hapless farmers always had them in plays, and he really wouldn't have minded looking as harmless as possible. Not that any farmer he knew was half so simple or harmless as bards made them out. "Hey, it's no trouble at all. Have a seat and tell us about your problems," Reiner said cordially. Alim was relieved to see him lose interest in Tiller and the women going back to pointedly not looking at each other. Alim sat down with a nod, but refused the drink he was offered. He wasn't going to trust anything coming from the hand of these people. "Well, there's this mine at the edge of the valley where my family farms. Everything was fine last year, but I had to leave and do my bit for the Earl, so I wasn't around. Some of our sheep started disappearing," Alim started. The group did not look impressed, but they didn't tell him to stop. In the interest of tension, he fumbled with his hip pouch. Like he hadn't been using it since he was old enough to be let out of the house. Not strange itself, exactly, only normally you find them eventually. Caught somewhere, eaten by something, this time though, nothing, Alim continued. So Maida wondered if maybe some of them strayed into the mine. He went to take a look and, well, he didn't exactly see anything, but something attacked him in the dark. Something that dropped this when he walloped it with a shovel. Alim pulled out the light stone as he finished. It glowed brightly in his palm. Not enough for anyone sitting at the other tables to notice, but enough that the group perked up. It ain't strange for monsters to nest in caves and whatnot, but having things like this? Maida said I should ask some adventurers for help since I can't go back yet. My contract isn't done till this year's end. So I couldn't even get more than a few days to come looking for help, Alim added ruefully. May I see that? The brunette cleric asked with a greedy look in her eyes. Alim handed the stone over with a thankful smile. Her eyes glowed faintly while she inspected it. Anything interesting, Lily? Reiner asked the cleric. We should investigate this. It would be good to spread the word of Strom's benevolence to this area, Lily said quickly. Alim forced a hopeful look, turning it from Lily to Reiner. As you say, Reiner replied with a smile that didn't touch his eyes. It gave Alim the creeps, but he kept that to himself. I'm truly grateful to you all. I've been worried something fierce about this, Alim said. He went back to his hip and withdrew the map 42 had given him as well as a small coin purse. He'd purposely taken some steps to deface the map and make it look less jarringly expensive. Namely, dumping an ale on it to blur the line work and folding it so the creases ruined a good portion. This is a family heirloom, but I'd be obliged if you'd accept it, and my gratitude, Alim said. He held both things out, curious who'd take them, and it was the cleric. She opened the coin purse, nodded, then opened the map. She winced a bit at how the paper made a delicate cracking noise thanks to how it had dried brittle. Someone in your family had a talent for drawing, Lily observed, clearly impressed. My great-granda, he was a mapmaker's apprentice till he lost a leg, Alim said proudly. On the one hand, he knew he should feel bad about how easily lies were flowing from his lips. But, on the other, the memory of the foul magic's hunger for Tiller quietly put his conscience in a chokehold until it quieted down. Taught Maida and me letters and all sorts of things. No talent for drawing in the family since him though, Alim's false pride settled into melancholic fondness. Now that he'd conjured the lie, he wished he'd actually had such a grandfather. Unfortunately, his had just been a petty noble with more ambition than intelligence. His fake one-legged map maker would have been more fun. Well, we'll make sure your family is safe, so you can lay your worries to rest, Reiner said with another vacant smile. Thank you kindly. Is there anything else I can do for you all? I have to go back to the barracks soon, but if there's anything, just say the word, Alim asked, laying it on thick. He'd rather leave, but he'd settle for keeping an eye on them for the rest of the night. No, we're happy to help. Your sincerity is more than enough, Reiner said. Alim nodded, not about to mention that a magic item like the Lightstone was worth a fair bit of coin on top of what he'd handed over. It was absurd that he'd just hand all of that over without so much as a contract, but he was fine with them ripping him off, so long as Tiller was safe. Then I'll leave you folks to your meal, Alim said, giving a deferential bow. Reiner nodded in reply, and he took his chance to leave. He was taking Tiller and running for it. Chapter 64. Civic Possibilities. Mistress 42. I cannot say if I've successfully fulfilled your request, but I have passed the map and Lightstone to a party that claimed interest. I'm not sure if they will actually go to the valley or not and did not desire to spend more time with them. I noticed strange magic affecting them and felt it was unsafe to remain near them. I apologize if this yields no results. Your servant. Alim Gray. I read the reply twice and felt like wincing each time. I'd really worded my request poorly, but there was only so much I could have done with what amounted to lure people to their doom, please. So really, I felt lucky he'd responded after only 2 days. Alim. Thank you for trying, don't worry if it doesn't work out. I'll think of another way to go about it. I'd like to hear more about the strange magic when you get a chance. -42. The reply wasn't stellar, but I sent it anyway. I wasn't in a position to promise I'd never ask Alim to do that or something like it again. Points were a matter of life and death for me, and the clock was ticking. Despite that, I put figuring out a way to attract people without involving Alim in the future on my to-do list. Well, bumped it up higher. I needed a serious amount of points, so it hadn't seemed feasible to rely on him alone in the first place. Really it would be easiest to connect with the post town at the end of the mountain range and use that as a jumping-off point. Maybe see if there was something like an adventurer's job board and post some stuff on it. I was just leery of it because being connected to a major thoroughfare felt risky. It would be annoying to move along the mountains to the valley, but it would be a more leisurely trip than through the desert. My fear was someone sending a subjection force along if I drew too much attention too quickly. I shook the thought off. Worrying about possibilities wouldn't do me any good. Instead, I needed to focus and work on my dungeon to make sure I could handle whatever ended up thrown at me. Not that I hadn't been before, but the possibility of guests gave it a greater urgency. "Wayacha doin'?" Chris demanded, startling me. I jumped halfway to the ceiling from where I'd been standing in front of my layout drawings. "Fuck," I growled, embarrassed. I didn't have a heartbeat, but fright filled my pseudo-flesh with a subtle vibration like a racing pulse. "Fuck all? Fucking up?" Chris asked sweetly. I flipped him off. "It's crazy you can get that high up but can't actually fly," Chris commented, like nothing special was happening. I scrubbed my face with my hands and waited for my slow descent as I calmed down. He was right, but he could shove it up his ass at this particular moment. "Can I help you with something, Chris?" I asked, once I was back on the ground properly. "I'd like more books," Chris said. I felt my orbs flicker. That had been a side project I hadn't worked on much for the last few weeks. Definitely a bit of a fuck up on my part. "Okay, want anything in particular?" I asked. Making illustrated first reader books wasn't really hard. At least not since I was decent at drawing and Chris wasn't demanding about the art. He seemed to like the quick cartoon style I usually went with. "Something longer, but not harder?" "Like that story you were telling about the man-bat," Chris said after a few moments of consideration. I couldn't help but laugh at that. As much that an assassin enjoyed stories about a vigilante as the butchering of the name. Okay, maybe not about him, but I'll think of something," I said after a few moments of deliberation. I wasn't interested in drawing gadgets and only had sketchy memories of the storylines anyway. "Maybe the grave man then?" Chris offered. "No," Henry cut in sharply from the door. I looked over in surprise, not used to him raising his voice. "Okay, not that," Chris said quickly, trying to look casual. I was still looking between them, wondering who the grave man even was, when Chris bolted for the door. Henry let him pass, but it was weird since he only stepped aside at the last moment. Usually, he was particular about manners and entirely polite. Once Chris was gone, I expected an explanation. Instead, I found Henry turning shy suddenly and not meeting my orbs. "I have no idea who the grave man is, but I take it you're not a fan," I commented mildly. Henry nodded, then hesitantly started making his way over to the couch. Him coming over to hang out and read or work on his embroidery projects every couple of days was fast becoming part of my routine. He was an assassin where Chris and I were from. One who was part of the anti-imperial faction during the Kingslayer rebellion, Henry explained. "Oh, that explains why Chris is a fan," I said and chuckled. "An assassin who maybe killed a king or at the very least targeted the nobility." I could see why Chris would be tickled by that. Unfortunately, Henry's mood didn't lighten, even though I didn't ask for more details. "Not to pry, but this seems like it's bothering you a lot," I said finally. It might not be polite to just point at the elephant in the room and ask what the fuck, but I certainly wasn't going to guess what was wrong based on social cues. "I was alive during the rebellion. It didn't go well," Henry said in a painfully flat tone. I winced. It was easy to understand why living through the interesting times the story was based on would make it a sore subject. I felt terrible for Henry and held my arms out, inviting him for a hug. Henry tilted his head in confusion after a couple of seconds. Apparently, there was no universal gesture for hug, in this world. I started to lower my arms, then felt a stubborn desire to double down. "Would you like a hug?" I asked. Saying the words felt awkward as hell, but there wasn't a reasonable alternative other than giving up. Henry surprisingly managed to get visibly tenser. What?" Henry asked, confusion plain in his voice. I was really going to have to figure out social norms relative to the dungeon denizens. Maybe send a group text about it and see how everyone felt. An embrace? Where I'm from, it's a gesture of comfort. You look upset to me, so I offered because I hoped it would make you feel better. Though, I won't do it again if it makes you uncomfortable. They weren't common everywhere, and I know that doesn't. My sociological rant was cut off. Henry stepped forward and gave me a hug. A beat late, I returned it. A moment after that, I remembered that neither one of us could feel much. I wanted to laugh at myself. I'd offered a physical gesture to someone it wouldn't do anything for. Still, Henry did seem to relax, and I couldn't say I didn't find it pleasant. It was probably only intellectual, but I felt better after a few moments. When Henry pulled back, I moved a little away, but not totally out of his space. Still want to hang out, or are you feeling like something else? I asked. I knew that anxiety could be draining. I wasn't going to hold it against Henry if he wasn't up to it now. I would like to stay, Henry said firmly. I nodded, happy to hear it. Henry joined me on the couch with a can of chaos beverage and a book. It wasn't exactly a thrilling combination, Henry reading while I worked in share mode, but I liked the quiet atmosphere between us. Having someone nearby made it more pleasant than when I was alone. Getting down to work once more, I started by reviewing my layout. Nothing jumped out at me as problematic, which wasn't surprising. I'd put a lot of effort into testing everything as I constructed it. The league matches also helped out since they were essentially play tests. The only thing I could see that still needed some obvious work was the placement of the stairs. I'd already discarded the idea of a single descending staircase because of the backtracking issue. That and the fact it was boring. The current design connected the exit of the prior layer with the beginning of the next. That was fine, but I'd essentially lined them up without meaning to, entrances at the north end and exits at the south. That setup was fine in theory, but I felt like it added a predictable element that made navigation a little too easy. So I decided it would be better to randomize the locations. Of course, the entrances and exits would still line up with cardinal directions, but that wasn't such a big deal. Accomplishing the change meant some fussing with the layouts, but nothing too serious. Thankfully I could select and rotate an entire layer. If I had to reset everything tile by tile, it would have been a nightmare. Some reworking was required to make everything fit well once I was done, but nothing extravagant. Finally, feeling accomplished, I decided to take a break and have a chaos beverage. What's that song? You've been humming it for a bit, Henry asked. Hey? Oh. I floundered, drawing a blank. I hadn't realized I was doing any such thing. Was it this? I asked, then tried humming a couple different things. That one, Henry said on my fourth try. I had to laugh at what ended up being the winner. It's a holiday song about a town full of monsters. I stopped cold. I'd been worrying about who to pick for the farm's caretaker since so many skeletons were interested. Really though, it would be pretty awesome to have a full-on town populated with skeletons. I had no idea how to make it work without freaking out the locals, but seriously, I could build my very own Halloween town. Chapter 65. Prioritizing priorities. It took a great deal of willpower for me to be a good dungeon master and not wholesale abandon everything I was doing and construct my own Halloween town. It didn't stop me fantasizing about it, however, even as I went about my work. Finally, I finished my redesign on the stairs and kicked a text to the Bone Brigade to tell them about what I'd done. Raid League wasn't scheduled for another day yet, but I knew most of the skeletons would do a walkthrough. As much out of curiosity as preparation for their matches. I continued being a model of self-control even after Henry returned to his crypt. He'd finished with his smaller project and wanted to work on one too large for my couch. For 2 days, I kept myself focused and on task. That I had added a large room where I was stockpiling building supplies to my chamber of machinations was not a breakdown in discipline. A fact I insisted to myself, even as I kept scribbling a town layout in the margins of basically everything. On the 3rd day, I finally did get my head properly back in the game. I still had the issue of a larger or more powerful force than I could handle showing up uninvited. Though I didn't know what would happen if I resorted to triggering a build alarm and exceeding the timer, I honestly didn't want to find out. Agony had impressed on me that it was to be avoided, and I believed him. The best option I could think of that didn't involve a Rube Goldberg level of complexity was a second entrance. Of course, I assumed it still needed to be connected to the valley, but that left a lot of leeway for location. Wanting to test my idea, I made a hallway that punched from the current back of the topmost layer clean through to the other side of the mountain. I also bought a couple surface tiles and cut a secondary entrance. I closed the main entrance off and immediately got an obstruction alarm. I'd been expecting that but didn't feel like it was a waste of time. It was better to make sure before I spent a bunch of mana I might not have needed to. I unblocked the entrance and started buying surface tiles. I didn't have enough mana to buy everything I needed all at once, but that was fine. I connected the area where I had my little lookout spot first. This time when I blocked the main entrance, I didn't get an alarm. The dungeon interior was still accessible from the valley. Curious, I blocked the secondary entrance and got a build alarm. It seemed like my theory checked out. When I placed a seal on an interior area, it didn't trigger because it wasn't totally inaccessible, even if access was restricted. An area like the necropolis being separated didn't block the path to my core, which I felt was critical. On the other hand, blocking the secondary entrance cut off a dungeon section from the path to my core. I did a bouncy series of swoops which constituted my happy dance. Changing which entrance could be used to access the dungeon wasn't a foolproof defense. If I was dealing with a powerful or sufficiently motivated force, it would at best be a delaying tactic. Still, it was a pretty good one, since whoever I was looking to stop would have to climb a mountain to get to the other side or go around. Quite the fuck you to any possible invaders in numbers or at a strength I wasn't comfortable with. Putting aside my elation at my new discovery, I became curious about what exactly was outside the second entrance. So I teleported over to survey the area. I was met with a view of dense forest. The trees were tall and oakish looking if you discounted the weird leaf shapes. Aside from that, the rocks were very stone looking. Very forest, much trees, as it were. My apparent lack of interest in botany in my previous life aside, I felt like I'd chosen the right side of the mountain to start on. If an elf walked out of the undergrowth in front of me, I wouldn't have been surprised. Mildly alarmed and running back into my dungeon for safety, but not surprised. Despite that, the aesthetic didn't speak to me. It was too mundane despite looking magic as could be. It had a bland fairytale book for kids kind of vibe. Subjective aesthetics aside, I would have to figure out something and make it work for me. The entrance, for example, could not remain as nothing but an oddly perfect tunnel mouth for long. Coming up with a new design to fit it wasn't an immediate priority, however. First things first, I loaded the tunnel up with traps as a preventative measure. I had quite a few laying around from discarded designs for Chris's playroom, so thankfully, I didn't have to spend excessive mana. Every scrap of that would be devoted to expansion for the next couple of days. Feeling more secure, I sent the hounds a text asking them to take turns guarding the second exit tunnel for a bit. I hadn't thought about it since I first planted my core, but it had been a while since I'd been outside my dungeon. I'd stopped exploring even the remaining sections of the original cave system that hadn't been included when my core initialized. I knew on an intellectual level that it was an oversight. I should have been looking around, seeing if there were other points of interest down the mountain range. Even if there weren't, it would have been worthwhile to map it fully just for my own reference. Despite all that, I felt a nervous thrill as I approached the boundary of my dungeon. From what I'd read about myself, there wasn't much that could hurt me. Only my core was vulnerable in a physical sense. I would be fine. Repeating that little mantra in my head, I left the boundary. I started my forest inspection, tossing random bits of everything into my inventory to find out what everything was. Definitely an effective method of cataloging the local flora and a few slower-moving examples of fauna. The longer I explored, the more uneasy I felt. As I had assumed I would be, I was fine, but now something else was nagging at me. My mind kept drifting back to my core and worrying about if it was safe. It was. I knew it was. I'd have been alerted if a raid were to occur, and I could easily open up the interface and take an anxious look at it. Despite all the logic and checking up on it, I still felt my anxiety growing. Clearly, I'd been spending a bit too much time cooped up inside if this was how badly taking a walk affected me. I wondered if this was how parents felt the first time they left their kids with a sitter. Finding nothing sufficiently interesting to keep me exploring, I decided to head back inside. I had things to do, and even if it was baseless, there wasn't a point in fighting the feeling without reason. It started to ease as I crossed back into my dungeon but didn't abate immediately. Really, it had been a while since I paid any attention to the lowest layers of my dungeon. Particularly since I'd set aside the hounds area. I teleported down to my core room. It was currently guarded by a miniature version of my first lava dungeon's boss room. A literal game of the floor is lava to keep out anyone with less than maxed out fire resistance. This version wasn't as flawed as the original. I'd made sure there weren't any convenient sniping points and set up the area where my core was, so it had to be climbed to reach it. At the back of the room, stairs led to where my core rested at the center of a stone flower I'd carved as its pedestal. Running my hand across the cold blue surface, I felt a calming, almost resonate feeling. A subtle humming that was answered by my being on some level. I'd thought it was pretty even before it activated, but now its glowing surface was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen with its semi-transparent layers of swirling blue. I felt something like an instinct, a desire to wrap myself around it like I had when I first planted it in the mine that became my dungeon. The soothing feeling I felt as I touched it invited me with a faint memory of something I felt would be like sleep. I shook the feeling off and pulled my hand back. I could technically do my work from anywhere, but it was a terrible idea. Seeing the layouts I created firsthand and tweaking them directly was far more effective than doing so remotely. I could come back and take a nap once my layout was finalized. But, for now, I had too much work to do. Chapter 66. Patterns. My primary focus for several weeks was getting my dungeon ready for possible visitors. The party Alim had described had at least 4 members he'd seen who were lower than 5th level. So the skeletons would most likely be enough to handle them, even if they made it past everything else. Despite that, I decided to act as if I was expecting a higher level party. Overkill was definitely preferable to underkill when it came to protecting my core. Especially since they had at least one weird magic item on them. If they had more, it would skew their overall power levels. The Bone Brigade ran the levels just after refresh every day. It gave me time to incorporate their notes into the day's building work. Aesthetic development took a backseat to practical concerns, but not completely. Since I had a framework in place already for most layers, they were still cohesive. To help facilitate the testing, I made a point of showing up in the necropolis daily. I'd chat with the skeletons before the test and after. Even so, I couldn't say I was any better acquainted with them than I had been before the meetings started. They'd started out getting a little more chatty with me, but that had quickly tapered off under the monotony. At the end of the 3rd week, I was starting to feel all work and no play would make 42 a dull girl. I felt dull. My body was not nearly so freakishly pliant as usual. Even my orbs felt oddly gritty despite being made of fire, or something that looked like it. Looking at the skeletons waiting for the debrief before the test, I felt like they were experiencing something similar. With a possible raid expected, the League had been put on hold. Even gambling had reached an all-time low in the tense atmosphere. Okay. No test phase today. I think we all need to do other things for a bit, I said finally. I hadn't made any significant changes, so waiting another day or 2 wouldn't hurt anything. You sure, boss? Jeffrey asked, sounding hopeful rather than surprised. yet. We've worn down the rough spots. It should be fine to leave off until I change anything major, I replied, my resolution to take a day off growing. The skeletons exchanged looks, and silent discussion, then looked back at me. Go on then. I'll text when I'm ready for another. Maybe we can get in a league match tomorrow instead, I said, and that caused a murmur of excitement. The Bone Brigade departed with more of a spring in their step than I'd seen in a week. I really had been negligent with morale. Free, I took the opportunity to go to my chamber of machinations and do absolutely nothing productive for a couple hours. I started with some yoga to get my body back to its normal, horrifyingly elastic state. Once I was satisfied I could move like a boneless abomination, I curled up on my couch with a can of chaos beverage. I wasn't really a passive lounger and opened my art interface instead. I didn't work on my layouts or aesthetics, though. I started drawing for fun. It had been a while since I'd made anything that didn't have an express purpose in mind when I started. It took a couple tries to shake the rust off and start just enjoying the process instead of worrying about the result. After that, it felt pretty nice to just dick around, though pure creational delight didn't last long. I couldn't help but dig into my low priority queue and drag out a project I'd neglected. Namely, creating team mascot drawings for the Raid League. Still, I kept it to rough thumbnails, enjoying the process rather than worrying about what the skeletons would think of my designs. I'd do things properly and work with them later, but I enjoyed just playing around for now. When I ran out of ideas and any desire to keep drawing, I checked my clock. I'd been messing around for about 4 hours. Then, after another round of stretches, I found I felt almost halfway normal. Still a bit sluggish and unmotivated, but nothing even half so severe as what I had felt just after refresh. Ideally, I would have rested a bit more. I didn't have a biological need for sleep, but I benefited from breaks and variety in my activities. Recent events had clearly illustrated that much. The couch and aimless art projects were tempting, but I couldn't help a certain amount of anxiety. I couldn't pinpoint precisely when, but I'd been feeling a kind of nagging sense of wrongness. Like something was just a little to the left of where it was supposed to be. A feeling that, like remembering that you forgot something, was irritatingly useless. System notice, patch available. A prompt appeared without so much as a chime. I looked at it curiously but didn't move to do anything. It didn't have anything like a request for permission, but I felt uneasy about how unexpectedly it had appeared. System notice, mandatory patch available. Activate patch, yes. Without warning, the notice changed to include a button. I wasn't even slightly tempted to accept it. I'd never seen a mandatory anything from the system before, and everything else had both accept and reject options. Not to mention the font was wrong. I didn't know what I was looking at, but it felt like some kind of scam. What the actual fuck? I muttered to myself. Hey Agony. I'm getting a weird prompt about a system patch. It says it's mandatory and only has an accept option. Am I paranoid? -42. I hit send, and an error tone sounded. That was not a good sign. Panicking a little, I threw the notice to the side, hoping it would close like a force-stopped browser window. It obediently disappeared to reveal a string of runes floating in the air where it had been. 42. Henry called from the antechamber. I looked over, surprised but not alarmed. Hey, come in, I said easily, happy to see him. He'd been around, but I'd been busier than usual, so we hadn't been talking too much. A stray glance at my system clock told me I'd been messing around for nearly 6 hours. I didn't have the keenest sense of the passage of time, but that was a little much. Put off by the discrepancy, I checked my event log. I felt like something major had to have happened. Instead of an explanation, I found a single new entry in what looked like runes. My anxiety instantly ratcheted up a couple of notches. I couldn't say what they looked like exactly, only that they felt oddly familiar. The more I tried to get the shimmering images to clarify, the more they seemed to skitter away from my orbs. 42. Henry inquired again. He was standing next to me now. My orbs flickered in surprise. Unless he had used a class ability, he shouldn't have been able to get so close so quickly. Sorry, guess I'm just kind of spacey today, I said, trying to shake off my unease. I felt like I'd forgotten something, but I couldn't explain what. Why you have seemed distracted lately, Henry agreed, looking me over in concern. As if he'd be able to uncover whatever was wrong just by looking. I probably need a nap, I muttered, recalling the sensation from my core. I wasn't sure, but spending some time with it again might help. Despite that, I couldn't justify doing so just yet. Not with adventurers potentially approaching as we spoke. Oh. I had heard the wicked require no rest, Henry offered with a chuckle. I couldn't help laughing at that. Perhaps I'm not so evil after all, I countered, scrubbing my face with my hands. A shuffling sound caught my attention, and I looked up to find Henry shift uncomfortably in place. An unusual thing for him to do, particularly since his initial case of nerves when he was summoned had subsided. He was also holding his hands behind his back, which was suspicious. Henry? I inquired, looking pointedly to his arms then back up to his jewels. He looked away from my orbs. Since you've felt out of SSSSS, Henry's words seemed to suddenly catch. It had been a while since he'd stuttered too badly, and this was a new level. It was like the words were threatening to choke him. Are you all right? I asked. Well. These. Here. Henry exclaimed. He tried to press a bouquet of roses to me. He'd misjudged the distance, however, and ended up lobbing them into my arms instead. My orbs flickered as we just stared at each other for several heartbeats, both of us surprised. Henry, I had no idea what I was going to say. Henry saved me from having to figure it out. He used his class's enhanced movement speed to sprint out of the room in a blaze of blue that matched his jewels. Bewildered, I looked down and found the roses were made of leather with carved stems. The flowers were blue-green on the outside with green hearts that resembled the color of my orbs. They were lovely. I spent a few moments studying them. They were the first gift I'd received since arriving. I wanted to display them and quickly carved a wall niche and simple vase for them. A message chime sounded just as I finished. Mistress 42. I had noticed you seemed out of sorts and wished to cheer you up. I hope that my antics have if the flowers did not. Apologetically. Henry. I couldn't help the exclamation or the laughter that followed. It was a sweet gesture, and if Henry had stayed, I'd certainly have given him a hug in thanks. I wanted to reply immediately, but ended up scrapping 3 drafts before finally settling on something reasonable. Henry. Your thoughtfulness would have been enough, but the roses are beautiful. I appreciate both. -42. I'd have been grinning if I had a mouth. As it was, I was doing a swoopy little dance, my prior troubles forgotten for the moment. Chapter 67. Choices. Though I was taking a break of sorts, I didn't neglect my regular chores. I expanded the internal layers and bought surface tiles just before the refresh. I was halfway to connecting the secondary entrance to the Stone Valley. Stone Valley was a shit name. Despite that, the second entrance was also in a valley. One among the foothills of the opposite side of the mountain range. I needed to call it something and was already calling the other one Green Valley. I might need to resort to a poll among the skeletons to officially determine what to call them. But, for now, the names would do as placeholders. Since I wasn't in a hurry to do anything for the moment, I used a few mana points to add to my chamber of machinations. Nothing fancy, just a cavernous room that I planned to use as a workspace. I tentatively labeled it my build lab. Though I hadn't been working on it for a few weeks, the idea of a town was never far from my mind. My first order of business was to copy the plans and doodles for it out on a wall in the lab. Once that essential bit of organization was done, I felt a pleasant sense of accomplishment. Having an idea was one thing. Taking steps to make it happen was an entirely different matter. The farmhouse had been a start, but I would need to do a lot of planning to pull off building a full-on town. Thinking of the farmhouse invariably got me thinking about Alim. We'd kept in touch, him asking me the odd question, me sending him lists, but we hadn't really talked lately. Not since I'd asked him to pass on the map. He'd done as I asked, but there was a shift in how he spoke to me after. I'd expected a change, possibly even anger, but the subtleness of what had happened left me confused and nervous. Nothing was wrong, but nothing was the same. I scrubbed my face with my hands. I knew I had a choice to make, but I felt out of my depth. This was a personal issue rather than a dungeon matter. Despite that, it wasn't something I could ask for advice on. This was something only I could decide how to deal with. Alim. I want your opinion on something. I think it might be interesting to add a town to my valley. I'm getting mixed reviews from the Bone Brigade. It seems like the architectural tastes where I'm from are pretty different from the local ones. This is the first building I've made. It's supposed to be a farmhouse. Let me know what you think when you get a minute. This isn't anything you need to hurry about. -42. I read the message a couple times before finally sending it. Attached were pictures of the farm and a drawing of its layout for clarity's sake. A bit like a well-done real estate listing back on Earth. It was a declaration of war, of a sort. I wasn't going to acknowledge any subtext, real or imagined. I wanted to be friends with Alim, and if he didn't want that, he would have to be blunt. My resolve did nothing to keep my innards from churning with an uncomfortable acidic tingle. Far too late, I realized Alim might think I meant to add the town as a kind of roach motel for people. Mortified, I started drafting a new message to explain my intent, then deleted the draft. I forced myself to calm down and take a moment. I'd already sent the first text. So instead of jumping to a panicked defense, I decided to let Alim respond and see what questions he had. To keep my mind off the message and possible replies, I decided to turn to some busy work. I'd already said we might have a raid league match the previous day to the Bone Brigade. So I sent a text to make it official. I followed that mass notice up with texts to the teams, including the rough idea I'd come up with for each team's insignia. The Crimson Centipedes were going to face off against the Violet Hive Bats, going by the match schedule. So I expected they would be the first ones to get back to me about possible insignia. Instead, it was the Silver-Horned Devil team led by Dawn who did. She had notes, a lot of notes, about the problems with the drawing I'd sent. I ended up laughing. I'd drawn something akin to certain versions of Satan back on Earth. But, looking up a horned devil in the encyclopedia, I found I'd been way off the mark. The creature attached to the name looked like what I'd have considered a sprite with horns. A humanoid body with a distinctively insectal cast to it and thin tapered horns. Nothing like the man-goat-beast thing I'd drawn. I sent Dawn an apology, explaining the mix-up, then quickly sketched out a new version. Working on art, doing my regular tasks, getting ready to have some fun, the day passed by quickly. None of the teams had picked an insignia by the time the match was due to start, but I didn't mind. While I was lost in thought over the idea of team banners, a sudden alert startled me. Alim, it seemed, had decided to speak directly. I picked it up immediately. Mistress, what causes a high fever, rash, yellowing eyes, and confusion? Alim asked harshly. Shocked, I turned to my encyclopedia and turned up 10 options. Of course, I'd need more information to narrow it down properly, but I didn't bother. I've given you potions for it. Who's hurt? I asked. If it were back in my old world, I'd need to keep asking to narrow down the specific condition. Thankfully here, I only needed to identify a cause, like infection or disease, to treat it. Doubly lucky the possible causes fell into 2 broad categories, so it wasn't expensive to help. It's Tiller. Alim cut off. I waited, assuming he was busy helping the lady in question. The call didn't disconnect, but I only heard faint background sounds and suggestions of movement for a couple of minutes. Is she all right? I can try something else if that doesn't work, I offered, feeling nervous. The symptoms had seemed reasonably distinct, but maybe Alim had misunderstood or failed to observe something important. Of course, neither one of us was a doctor. She's all right. Her fever's down, and she's calm, Alim said, sounding tired. I'm glad. Are you sure you're okay? I asked, hesitant to end the call. If something had happened to Tiller, then Alim might have been in danger too. I checked his stats, but didn't find anything amiss, and Marlowe seemed fine too. I'm fine now, Alim replied. The words caught me oddly. He was physically fine, and there wasn't any indication he'd been harmed earlier. So that meant he hadn't been fine for a different reason. Which potion helped? The green was for poison, and the yellow was for sickness, I asked. Since there wasn't an immediate threat, it was probably best to figure out what happened. The green one, Alim said, sounding worried. I'm copying the information I looked up. I'll send you the list of poisons that match those symptoms. A lot of them are from plants, though. So be careful, all right? I said, more than a little worried. I will, Alim replied. Where are you right now? I asked, scanning the information. I sent it once. I felt sure I had everything pasted legibly. We made camp in the woods. I just got the text, Alim said, and things went quiet. I assumed he was reading. Fuck, I recognize the third plant down. We walked through a patch of it, Alim hissed. I took a look at the entry, red regassa shrub. It wasn't super toxic most of the time, just irritating to the skin on contact. The problem was the pollen, which would fuck a person up during its brief release season. I'll add some more potions to the inventory, just in case. Give Tiller the red one when she feels up to drinking it. It should fix any injury she suffered from the poison. The green one's an antitoxin for you, just in case, I added, feeling bad for the mystery lady. I added a low-cost physical healing potion as I spoke. I was surprised that Alim was fine given what they'd been through, and added an antitoxin for him just in case it was a delay of symptoms rather than him being free and clear. Reasonably, I should have given Alim some advice for how to look after Tiller, then hung up. He sounded like he could use some rest. Instead, I was just waiting, too indecisive to do it myself. Again silence dragged for a few minutes. Mistress. Thank you for your help, but please don't count this as a debt on Tiller's part. I'll repay it myself, Alim said finally. I felt my orbs flicker. That wasn't what I'd been expecting him to say. Alim. I started only to falter. My nature and our contract complicated the relationship between us considerably. He wasn't wrong to assume I'd require payment from someone even if he was wrong about my intent. I can't contact her, and she's not in a contract with me. She's safe, I said finally. It was all the comfort I could offer, thin as it was. Alim didn't reply, and I wasn't sure what, if anything, more that I should say. I could lie that I wouldn't make contracts with people he knew, but I didn't bother. I would if I had a reason to. I'd rather not. I'd feel better if you set a price, Alim said finally. I flinched a little at that, though I couldn't exactly blame him. Feeling like you owed someone wasn't easy. No, I said firmly. You didn't agree to a bargain beforehand, so neither one of you owes me anything, I continued. We already had a deal, and it was good enough for me. Any agreement we reached now wouldn't have anything to do with what I've already given you, I added to clarify. Even wanting to be friends, denying that we had a transactional relationship due to the contract was pointless. One that followed rules that Alim needed to keep in mind and understand for his own protection. Relying on my goodwill wasn't a smart move. I just... Alim started, then faltered. I remembered what he'd said earlier and had to wonder who exactly Tiller was to him. I take it she's important to you, I said, trying to be gentle. I didn't really need to ask. Alim had called me thinking there would be a cost and wanted to pay the debt himself. I don't know about that, Alim muttered. Alim, you're willing to make a deal for her, I said bluntly. If he was trying to snow me, that was fine. But, if he hadn't realized what he was doing, he was brick-level dense, and I was doing him a favor pointing it out. Shit. She is. We didn't know each other long, but we got on all right. Then she thought I died and came to check on my mother, give her money, Alim explained. I flinched. Tiller sounded like a nice person. I could understand Alim being defensive of her. I don't want her to end up in trouble because of me, Alim added, sounding tired. I really can't do anything to her as things stand, I offered. But working for you might bring danger, and I can't tell her why. So I'll part ways with her soon, Alim countered. I almost said something but paused. What Alim was saying translated to him wanting to keep her around. That he wasn't was because she couldn't make informed choices without knowing about me. It was a rational decision. It was also convenient for me. The more people who knew a secret, the harder it was to keep. But, despite that, my eyes drifted over to a vase of leather roses. Cutting people out of his life to keep my secret or try to protect them would be miserable for Alim. You can if you want to. Tell Tiller about me, I said finally. Would she really be better off if she stayed? If she knew? Alim asked quietly. I knew it was a rhetorical question. Not knowing wouldn't make it less true or let her make better choices. Knowing lets her decide what she wants to do, be it stay or go, I offered. I'll think about it, mistress, Alim said softly. I ended the call a moment later. I looked at the roses again, then got up and started heading for the necropolis. The game was due to begin soon, but really I just didn't feel like being alone any longer. Chapter 68. Death Arrangements. The day after my conversation with Alim, I wondered if he'd made up his mind about Tiller. I'd tried to be cool about it at the time, but I was very curious about this mystery lady. I was also sincerely hoping she'd be okay with what was going on. I'd feel bad if she bolted because it was too much. But I also wouldn't be able to blame her. Instead of being a busybody, I got to work. I'd initially started with human skeletons, but I'd started buying halflings a while back and had a fairly large group now. I could have technically started adding in dwarves, too, but I wanted to get the halflings settled in first, and there were still issues with their living arrangements. As such, I was in my giant new build lab playing with layouts across several mock UPS. 7 of the 8 halflings I'd summoned thus far were currently looking them over. I'd started them in smaller but still human-styled crypts, which were like apartments. They had quickly expressed discomfort with that arrangement. Mistress, do we have to live alone? Perrin Shimmermoon Phalange asked. She was the second halfling I'd summoned and a rogue. She'd also been the most outspoken on the subject of names, having me go through 8 first and 3 middles before we settled on it. Honestly, I liked her quite a bit because of that. What? No, you guys can pair up however you like, I said offhandedly. I only had half my attention on the group while I was doodling alternative layouts. Nothing seemed to be striking their fancy so far. A bit late, I realized that probably warranted something a little more in-depth explanation-wise. I want everyone to be comfortable. So you can feel free to experiment and try different living arrangements whenever you like, I explained. My words were punctuated by a thud and the dry rattle of bones as something landed beside me. I jumped away in surprise. Does that apply to choosing not to live with our own kind? Icarus asked. He'd been the missing 8th of the 8 halflings. Fucking hell, Icarus, I said but couldn't help laughing after. I'd wondered where he'd gotten off to, and it seemed like he'd been exploring the prototypes for the town project, currently on hold. Icarus looked at me expectantly. As if he hadn't just jumped out of a second-story window ever so casually. Humans commonly used stairs and doors, but halflings had as much respect for those as Chris did for manners. Their racial description declared halflings as naturally acrobatic. I couldn't really hold it against them if they took it to 11 now that they were free of the mortal coil. All right. Yes, to answer your question. You can live on your own or with whoever you like. Stuff like that is up to you, and I'm not going to police it, I said after regaining my composure. Icarus nodded thoughtfully, then took off running. I think he likes tall, mistress, Perrin said archly, which wrung a giggle from her cohort. Likes? I caught on just before I asked a really dumb question. Icarus ran back toward the necropolis where there were only humans. Right after asking if he could live with someone not of his species. What was going on was not rocket surgery, no matter how slow I was. As long as the other party agrees, it's none of my business, I said flatly. This fell into that category of things that were 300% none of my business. What the hell they would even get up to if they did live together was filed similarly. I was about to try and change topics but paused. As uncomfortable as talking about it made me, it was necessary. I needed to be clear on what I meant. To be frank, I don't care about anything that happens between consenting sapient beings. Gender, species, the number of partners, none of that is my business, I said bluntly. I'd have to send a text out about it later, but hopefully it was enough of an explanation for now. Wait, so you don't care if we live in groups? Zorik Amber Clavicle asked. Like I said, it's up to you guys what you do. And I mean platonically or otherwise, I clarified. The halflings all looked at me suspiciously, then started talking amongst themselves. I waited, curious what was going on since it seemed like a very intense discussion. They were at it for a solid 10 minutes before they finally looked back at me. Finally, Perrin stepped forward as the spokesperson. We have some requests, Perrin said resolutely. It took 2 hours, but finally, a design of sorts was agreed upon. Sleeping chambers with capsule hotel-style crypts in groups of 2 or 4 would connect to a shared room. That room would connect with a larger common room that served 3 such setups. I called it the cluster and branch style in my head. There was a kind of fractal aspect to the design. Or at least there would be if it got big enough. Right now, there weren't enough halflings to fill up even one section of it, but I still constructed a complete set of 3 branching clusters. Not because it would be needed soon due to numbers. The issue was a need for space so they could work out their social arrangements. Apparently, these halflings all embraced a kind of semi-fluid poly-grouping. Being used to halflings as simple country folk with associated quaintness, I really didn't know how to process that. So I filed it in the shrug pile of things to worry about never. Based on what I'd learned, I did need to consider getting more of them than I strictly needed. The humans seemed to be doing fine, but I was getting a distinct impression that halflings needed a higher population density to be comfortable. It was less of an issue than a decision, however. I could do it easily enough. I just needed to make up my mind and decide if I'd put off onboarding the next species or do it simultaneously. For the moment, though, I should finish the task in front of me. I could worry about how many halflings I would be housing after I had some accommodations for them. Is this all right? We can do aesthetics now or after you guys settle in, I asked. After we settle in, Perrin ventured after another group discussion. It was kind of nice to see the halflings actually taking an interest and talking to each other about things. Unfortunately, the humans rarely gave me any sort of feedback. Aside from a few notable exceptions, anyway. All right, I'll mock up a new test set using the design we agreed on. Then, once you guys feel comfortable with the dimensions, I'll add it to the necropolis, I explained happily. Can we explore the other buildings while you do? Zorik asked. I nodded, and the group went bounding off to explore the house and store I'd been experimenting with. It was fun to watch them excitedly clamber in through a window as if there wasn't a door. The final version was approved after some adjustments. With one task down, I crossed into my chamber of machinations. Henry would be dropping by to show me some of the work he'd been doing with Raid League Team Tabards. I could tell the skeletons apart through arcane means most of the time. It just got hard to keep who was who straight when they were fighting, especially if they were of the same class and wore similar gear. A problem the skeletons apparently suffered as well. Bouncing around in my chamber of machinations, I wondered if I'd designed it a little plain. It was mostly a workroom like the build lab with the addition of a couch. It felt a little like I was working out of a studio apartment, guests being made to sit on the futon in the least professional of arrangements. Not that I slept. A chime sounded, and I snapped out of my musings instantly. I felt like I had heard it somewhere but couldn't place it. One that filled me with a much more familiar roiling dread. Hostile party detected. The system alert informed me, hearkening back to the tutorial. A party of adventurers was tip-tap-tapping at my door. Chapter 69. Obligatory harem shenanigans. After a few weeks of leisurely travel, the heroes of Stromhold were close to their objective. All of the landmarks were lining up correctly with the map a simple soldier had provided them with. Reiner rode in the lead but sat uncomfortably on his mount, heavy sword at his hip ready for anything. He'd grown up in an orphanage, unaware of his grand destiny as befitted a hero. This made riding skills a recent acquisition on his part, particularly as he'd never much cared for horses before. Despite that, he rode a majestic white steed of the highest quality, not that he would be able to tell if it wasn't. With the likely ruin not far away, he should have picked up the pace. Instead, he kept it easy and made a point of not looking around him, just dead ahead. He could feel a kind of tension in the air, but it wasn't one of an impending threat. Lillian rode just behind Reiner in the party order, as was her privilege as a cleric of Stromhold. Andrea and Mina came next, with Myra taking up the tail end if one discounted the demi following them on foot. Lillian automatically did, barely registering its presence. Mina, how is it you've become so filthy? Honestly, even the demi is more hygienic than you, and it's, well, a demi, Andrea said with a haughty tilt of her chin. She was striking with vibrant red hair and green eyes, but her attire wasn't the least bit practical for riding. However, it refused to allow the wind-blown sand to dirty it, a mark of her noble lineage as much as her attitude. Easy Andrea, Reiner chided gently, barely registering the jib between the ladies. He was accustomed to putting out sparks before they ignited into conflict to the point of numbness. Nevertheless, he still managed not to look back even as he felt a strong pull to do so. Instead, he kept his eyes on their destination, a looming wall of colorfully banded stone. Reiner, I sense magic ahead. I'm not sure we should trust the map or the man who gave it to us, Myra said, already sounding resigned to being ignored. She'd voiced similar thoughts before, only to receive identical glares as she was now from the two women riding in front of her. To question the wisdom of the hero was not allowed. I don't trust him, but we should look into this anyway, Reiner replied, his tone tried. Myra almost said something more, lifting a hand with a concerned look. The entire party winced, Reiner struggling but eventually losing a fight with himself and his hand going to his sword's hilt. A moment later, they all straightened, sitting confidently in their saddles as if they hadn't spoken. Hecha, the rabbit-like demi-human's ears perked up, and she scented the breeze blowing from the valley. She looked curiously at Myra, who refused to look at her before sighing and turning her attention to Reiner. I smell grass and water. Too much for this place. It's unnatural, Hecha said bluntly. She recoiled a moment later as a convulsive spark of power coursed through her, almost sending her to her knees. Mina glared, pissed that the creature had dared address the hero directly. Reiner stopped abruptly, turning to look at what had happened. He took in Hecha's state, but no emotion crossed his face. A moment later, as he looked at the other women, a soft smile pulled at his lips along with a sympathetic expression. I know this isn't ideal, but it's a hero's job to investigate things like this. I promise to keep all of you safe no matter what we end up facing within, Reiner said, hand on his sword as he spoke. All three young women smiled and nodded in reply. Myra, though, cast a furtive glance at Hecha. Reiner, would it be alright if I took over monitoring the demi? Myra asked, hesitant. Mina and Andrea looked at her with open confusion. She'd never asked for that duty and, if anything, actively avoided it before. Why now? Mina demanded. She didn't care for the task, but she was reluctant to relinquish a duty Reiner had given her. Mina, don't be harsh, Reiner chided with a rueful smile. His eyes were cold despite the way his lips curved. We're all doing our best. It's just taken Myra a little longer to come around about this. Right, Myra? Reiner asked. Myra nodded, pretending not to be able to see the suspicion clearly written in his eyes. He gestured, and with a pout, Mina relinquished the key that controlled the slave collar to Myra. Just so everyone feels comfortable, show them you can use it properly, Reiner added. Myra's eyes went round, and so did Mina and Andrea's. He usually didn't care if or when they disciplined the demi. He would even suggest they be lenient sometimes. Mina didn't say a word, just nodded as she took the key and looked toward the demi. Blue energy crackled around the key and a moment later was mirrored by the collar. A discipline command had been issued, and Hecha let out a surprised yelp before collapsing to the ground and writhing in pain. Enough, Reiner said quickly. His expression remained placid, but his hand fell heavily on Myra's shoulder. She eased up, and the blue energy vanished. Reiner gave her an approving smile but turned away quickly. Hecha got to her feet, and the party continued onward. The solid wall of stone they'd noted in the distance rapidly approached, and finally, at midday, they found themselves at the entrance to what seemed like a natural labyrinth. But, even with the strangely detailed map at their disposal, the stone maze they found themselves facing was not easily traversed. Reaching the midway point by nightfall, they made a camp and settled in for a restful night. The young ladies slept in a reasonable arrangement around the fire instead of crowding around Reiner despite the adoring glances they typically sent his way throughout the day. In the morning, they reached the end of the maze and found themselves looking at a startlingly lush valley. After spending days in the desert, just the sight of the small lake would have made it seem like an oasis, but the greenery made it feel like paradise. Maybe we judged our nameless friend a little too harshly, Reiner said wryly. As they'd been told, there was a farm in the valley right where the map indicated it would be. Stronghold sends tests in many forms, Lillian offered. Behind her, Mina and Andrea both rolled their eyes. Lillian had been the least pleased about accepting the request in earnest instead of just pocketing the money in light stone. Instead, she preferred taking the assignments they received from the church and ignoring all others. When they arrived at the house, they found it empty but well provisioned with no indication of what had happened to the occupants. With the sheep and other animals all grazing placidly nearby, it was clear they hadn't taken them to another pasture. It seems we're too late to help them, Mina offered as she looked curiously at the house's interior. And that we underestimated them. Perhaps they had minor noble lineage. This house is too fine by far, Andrea said but in a dismissive tone. It reminds me of home a little, Mina offered. No one took an interest in her statement as they were all busy with their own searches of the residence. We'll see if we can locate the mine, but we'll spend the night here and leave in the morning. No sense in going in at night even with a light stone, Reiner offered. Mina nodded with particular enthusiasm. There was a large wooden tub that could be used for a bath, and she was ecstatic at the chance to be sand-free again. With a detailed map, it wasn't hard to find the mine entrance that had been mentioned. What took far too long was getting Lillian to leave the pagan temple they'd encountered on the way. It was an oddly simple thing, little artwork, statues that were only a crude suggestion of a male form. Really, it was almost impossible to tell who it was supposed to be dedicated to. Despite that, it had taken Reiner lifting her bodily over his shoulder to get the ordinarily docile cleric to leave. She'd been intent on destroying everything in sight with her morning star. A task that proved difficult at best as everything was carved into actual stone. Looks like our farm boy really wasn't shady, Mina said once they were back at the farm. Tired from her rampage, Lillian was already asleep in one of the rooms upstairs. Please, it beggars belief that farmers could survive living next to a dungeon, let alone map it, Andrea replied haughtily. Lillian had said something similar, but that was expected. As a cleric, she tended to have a black and white view of the world. Things that agreed with her being white and everything else being black. It's probably weak, Mina retorted. We'll find out in the morning. I'm curious to see how docile this dungeon actually is, Reiner broke in before a fight could start. Chastised, no matter how gently, both Mina and Andrea pouted before turning in for the night. When the group awoke, it was to the sound of Myra crying. She clutched her stomach before running for the outhouse. Lillian, as the party's healer, checked on her before returning with a grim expression. She thinks the peaches we bought a few weeks back turned, Lillian said, clearly annoyed. Unfortunately, her healing abilities were limited and didn't cover disease. You're joking, Andrea said, clearly disgusted. Well, it's not like she really helps anyway. We can do the initial survey without her, Mina offered. I don't think it would be right to leave without her, Reiner said. It earned him touched but slightly pitying looks from the ladies. Mina has a point. We don't know how long it will take for her to feel better, Andrea offered. The two exchanged a look, a temporary truce established. She'd be alone if something happened, Reiner objected. We could leave the demi with her as protection. It shouldn't be around when you're doing hero's work anyway, Lillian suggested. Andrea and Mina both raised an eyebrow at that. It was clear the cleric didn't like demi-humans in general, but Hecha was a strong fighter. She was usually the unacknowledged sixth member of the party. I'll talk to her and see how she feels about it, Reiner said finally. Once he was gone, all three women shared a knowing nod. They would get their way. All right, you three win. She said she didn't want to slow us down, Reiner said when he returned. So, after double-checking their supplies and ditching the suspect peaches, they were on their way. Chapter 70. Obligatory harem shenanigans 2, The Continuing Adventures. In the early hours of the morning, the hero party found themselves facing what looked suspiciously like a mundane mine. According to the peasant who'd supplied them with the map, that was precisely what it was, but they'd expected something more. The entrance was undoubtedly fancier than the average mine with a stone platform and roof. Things that would have been absent or made of wood in other places. Nothing to get too excited about. Maybe this isn't a dungeon? Mina asked as she walked inside. What makes you think that? Andrea asked sharply. It might not be, but there's little chance that an artifact-level light stone came from a normal mine. Even an ancient one like this, Lillian interjected. The three ladies glared at each other before realizing that Reiner was still walking. They all hurried to catch up to him. What do you mean ancient? Andrea asked sharply. Exactly what I said. See how smooth the pillars are without any joining? They had to have been carved by magical means. No one would have bothered with that for something like a mine. Not after the fall of the Mage Kingdom, Lillian replied. She was distracted, running a hand over a pillar. As if looking for some clue as to how it had been made originally. Right? The other ones always felt like dungeons. They just dripped with this kind of hot Doritos breath malice, like a net troll on a tirade, Mina said disbelievingly. Andrea blinked, only able to make out half of what was said. There had been a pattern when they had previously been sent to deal with a few small dungeons. Usually, a grand entrance of some kind would lead to a maze filled to the brim with traps and monsters. But, after walking for an hour and encountering nothing of note, their expectations were entirely in tatters. Reiner, it's possible that Mina was correct. The lightstone might have been a fluke, Lillian offered reluctantly. They had only been able to navigate the tunnels thus far, thanks to the relic in question. She'd hoped they'd find more, but that hope was fading. Possibly, but we've only scratched the surface according to the map. I want to at least make it as far as the farmers were able to before calling it quits, Reiner said offhandedly. His tone was almost harsh, and there was no trace of a smile on his face. He was also looking at a map none of the women had seen before. Reiner, where did that come from? Andrea asked, the most forward of them as always. What? Oh, I found it while I was poking around the house. It looks like the family mapped a bit of the mine at some point, Reiner said casually. Mina's expression scrunched up in annoyance, though she couldn't say why. If it were anyone other than Reiner, she might have thought it was a dumb move to not mention the new map. Reiner was above reproach in her eyes, however, so that couldn't be it. Can I see it? Mina asked. Reiner went to hand it to her, but they both flinched. Then, pulling it back, he held it so she could take a look rather than letting her have it. Andrea and Lillian both quickly joined in, unwilling to let Mina be closest to him. Despite the crowding, they all eventually had a look and felt uneasy. Like the map leading to the valley, it was well done. Something that seemed unlikely since it wouldn't have had much utility to the one-legged ancestor supposedly responsible for the other one. I'm not really comfortable with how easy this all seems. Like that guy had total NPC vibes with how he just handed us a sack of coins like that was normal, Mina said. NPC? Whatever. Anyway, that hit should have knocked him on his ass, Andrea chimed in with an undignified snort. The pair of them exchanged a long-suffering look and nodded in commiseration a split second before they were assailed by headaches. They jumped apart, then glared at each other once the pain stopped. Stromhold likely guided the young man to reward and sent us on our path, Lillian said dismissively. It was her stock answer, along with Stromhold works in mysterious ways. Lil's right. It would hardly be the first time someone just miraculously showed up to hand us directions, Reiner said bitterly. The party shared a look of commiseration. They really didn't want for randos offering them stuff to do. They all flinched a bit, the impious thought vanishing from their minds. What were we? Andrea asked, her train of thought lost. They all exchanged baffled looks. Reiner was the first to just shrug. Onward to adventure, Reiner said and started walking again. After 2 more hours of exploring, they finally arrived at something more in line with what they'd hoped to find. The tunnel they'd been walking in opened into a large chamber with a slanted roof. A bright shaft of morning light spilled down to illuminate a grand entrance. The sight was enough to give the party pause, but Mina quickly noticed something odd. Beyond the band of light, something faintly glowed. Stepping into the shadows, Mina found alcoves cut from floor to ceiling along the wall. On the floor of each was an unfamiliar and intricate magic array. Lillian, there's something magic and weird, Mina chirped. Magic was something she could use but not something she really understood on any deep level. Despite calling out to the cleric, it was Andrea who immediately went to take a look. These are arrays, right? Andrea asked. She'd gone over to inspect one of the alcoves and immediately squatted down in a most unladylike fashion. She looked like she was ready to start poking things with a stick. Lillian quickly joined her. As a cleric, it wasn't normal for her to be so well versed in general magic instead of holy, but she'd always felt it was something worth studying. Unfortunately, what she'd learned in the field didn't help her identify what she was looking at. No, the only source for a positive identification came from the drawings of a heretic Lillian seen once by chance. Despite knowing what it was, she still sounded the magic, wanting to be wrong. It took a great deal of self-control to only collapse to the point where she was sitting flat on the floor instead of passing out. It's a teleportation circle, an active one, Lillian said faintly. That means this could be a ruin, right? Mina asked. Lillian just nodded mutely in reply. Mina couldn't remember when, but she knew they'd talked about ruins at some point. It had been a friendly conversation. That brought on a flicker of pain before she dismissed the idea. They might have talked, but she couldn't see it being anything more than coldly polite. Well, shall we begin? Reiner asked, already heading down the stairs at the back of the room. All three women looked at him in irritation before feeling a jag of pain and following after him quickly. The stairs were broad and comfortably deep, hewn from the stone of the passageway with great skill. All that gave away their age was a slightly worn spot toward the middle that looked like it had been carved by the passage of countless feet over time. Man, back home, people would have killed for a countertop made of this stuff, Mina said, tapping the rose and gold marble of the passageway. Yes, your wonderful land full of magicless savages, Andrea said with a roll of her eyes. Mina flipped her off, but as they came to the next level, all hostility was forgotten. It looked like another section of the mine, but this one was lit by light stones. Damaged ones going by how they flickered or only glowed dully, but still light stones like the one they'd been lured by. Lillian, you said this was a relic. Are these? Reiner asked, gesturing at the light fixtures. Lillian nodded, pale but still confident. Looks like we hit the jackpot, Reiner said with a smile. It was genuine, if greedy, and stretched his mouth and reached his eyes. Seeing it, Andrea laughed and gave him a friendly slap on the shoulder, joining him for a moment. Right? Let's loot this bitch, Mina joined in before grabbing her head. Everyone present was rocked by pain severe enough to make them falter and go to their knees. Reiner fought it but eventually grabbed the hilt of his sword. A few moments after that, the pain subsided, and they all got back to their feet. Well, let's continue our quest, Reiner said, smile gone and replaced by a parody of the genuine one. Everyone else agreed with vapid smiles. Chapter 71. Questionable Friends. Sitting in what I was now calling the bleachers of the necropolis entry zone, I watched the heroes advance. It took them a while to make it to the formal entry area and the first of the blue stacks. They seemed like they were going to move cautiously at first, but that vibe quickly disappeared. It was weird to watch, as they would occasionally stop and take stock of things. Like they were going to make a serious study of the dungeon and what they were seeing. It would have been the smart thing to do. Despite their familiarity with the layout, the skeletons always took the time, just in case I'd added a surprise. Instead of doing anything useful aside from taking the occasional break, they mostly bickered during the short pauses. Or at least what I assumed was bickering going by expressions. On prior occasions, I'd noticed the security feed didn't include audio but hadn't thought that was too weird. It would probably be too much of an advantage to hear the party making plans as they worked. I got a distinct feeling it wouldn't have been the case this time. These idiots seemed like they would make me wish for a mute function. Rather like I had when I had to watch the tutorial heroes take their victory lap after breaking my first practice core. The idea of using a shattered core for magic jewelry was still gross to think about. With misplaced determination, the party pushed through the blue stacks up to the first mini-boss. It was the giant centipede I'd named Squish. 9 times out of 10, the skeletons didn't even need to pause during a league match to kill it. Poor dude rarely got to do more than hiss before he was stomped. Thankfully, he wasn't sentient. The fuck? Chris asked, sounding baffled. A murmur had gone up among those watching, which wasn't that big a crowd. The skeletons had opted mainly to have me send out a mass text when the heroes got to the moles rather than sit through the newbie level stuff. What? I asked, having zoned out a bit. I'd thought I should watch the party's progress right from the start but felt like that was turning into unintentional masochism. They're assuming some manner of formation, Henry said, watching intently but radiating annoyance. I looked up at the screen, and sure enough, the party had changed from loosely walking in a cluster to a more different cluster. Combat tactics were not my thing. The guy with the sword whose name I'd forgotten was out in front, with the girls flanking him on either side. Reiner, I corrected, after looking above his head to check it like he was a sim. The effort the party was putting into facing off against Squish felt like overkill. Still, I couldn't say it might not be a reasonable precaution if they weren't familiar with centipedes. Maybe they thought he'd spit poison or something. An idea that was quickly dispelled as Reiner lunged forward to attack. What the fuck? I asked no one and everyone. Which bit? Chris asked, watching the screen intently now. He'd been watching since the heroes first entered the dungeon, but without any enthusiasm. Squish shouldn't give them this much trouble, I said flatly. Squish was a mini-boss. I hadn't anticipated him giving a single adventurer trouble, let alone 4. Really, a couple of ordinary people with decent weapons should be able to handle him. Reiner, for some reason, was going at it alone and hacking away with only moderate success. Squish almost managed to summon another centipede before he was finally felled. I turned away as the girls in the party started to congratulate Reiner for his victory. It's like that guy doesn't know how to use his sword, I added. I was not a combat expert, but I was used to seeing the skeletons fight. So I could tell something was wrong, very wrong, with how the dude was fighting. He doesn't. And not properly, Henry chimed in from where he was sitting next to me. Okay, I'm going to see if I can find out, I cut off. I'd meant to take a more serious look at what little the system would tell me about the party. I already knew it wouldn't give me levels from the tutorial. Since I'd been in the security view the entire time, I hadn't bothered looking at the standard map view. I only switched over since I'd need to tap their icons to see any additional information. Holy shit, I muttered. I tapped Henry and pointed out the guy's icon. It was an archer. Fighters could technically use any weapon, but I'd learned talking to the skeletons that they did need to pick a primary specialty if they didn't want to suck. This guy had chosen a bow but was using a sword. Poorly. Henry simply nodded, apparently unsurprised. Reiner was both in the wrong position and using a weapon he wasn't good with. I really had no idea what was going on anymore. Their formation makes no sense either, Jeffrey added. That caused more than a few skulls to nod in agreement. Even if he had the armor for it, this guy isn't built to take hits. So him being in front is a dumb move. I nodded, having no illusion that Jeffrey's explanation was for anyone's benefit other than my own. I know I shouldn't look gift points in the mouth, but this feels really wrong, I said finally. That also got some nods, though not as many as the previous comment. Second thoughts, mistress? Dawn asked archly. Chris looked over at me disapprovingly, but I chose to ignore the murder goblin for the moment. No. Not like that anyway, I started and faltered. My thoughts were a little hard to articulate to those who would have no frame of reference for what I was thinking of. I'm just worried. Alim mentioned some kind of weird magic at work. Only I have no idea what since the system isn't going to tell me. At least not until they're all defeated, I explained. Even then, there was also the chance it wouldn't since I had no idea what Alim had seen. I'd drawn a kind of forensic sketch of what he described at the time, but none of the magic users had known what it was. I don't want this to turn into them having some kind of unexpected power that lets them break through even though they suck, I said honestly. It was a shitty cliché from Saturday morning cartoons, but I felt an eerie trepidation as I thought of it. I was a dungeon core in a world with magic and heroes. So betting my safety on things making sense according to the rules of my old world was a dumbass move. One that seemed like an excellent way to get my core kicked in. The power of friendship, at least, didn't seem like it would be an issue. I didn't know exactly what the dynamic was, but it was not a cheerful one. They looked a lot more like they were stuck together than a happy group of friends. An added WTF factor was that the girls would occasionally give sultry looks to Reiner. Not that it was weird in and of itself for a bunch of teens. It was the bizarre performative vibe to it that had me confused. I felt like there was a pattern to it, but I couldn't quite place it. Reiner giving almost no response to it was also odd. Not that he had to reciprocate or anything, but a total non-reaction didn't make sense. This lot having some kind of hidden ace isn't likely, but possible, Aaron offered. I jumped a little in surprise, having forgotten he'd joined the group for a change. I wasn't the only one. He'd been sitting in a corner writing in a notebook long enough for most of the skeletons to forget he was there. Would you be able to tell if they did? I asked. Aaron chiming in half-heartedly was soothing in a way. It left me feeling less nervous but moderately more irritated. Possibly, if I was near enough to see directly. Depending on what type of magic it is, and if it's an item, Aaron explained, still not looking up from his notes. My fingers drummed on my arm where I'd crossed them. Something rude danced on the tip of my mental tongue. Thank you for letting me know, I said neutrally in the end. Aaron was Aaron, and if anything, this was him being reasonably helpful. Sure, it didn't actually help, but at least he was explaining things. Taking out circumstances beyond his control on him would have been a bastard move on my part. You're welcome, Aaron said offhandedly, going back to his notes. That gave me a moment's pause, though I managed not to snicker. He really was sociable today. Okay, bet's open tomorrow when they get up after sleeping, Dawn informed the group at large. This time I couldn't help but snicker as the room filled with enthusiasm. Why anyone had opted to watch the party during the early portion of the dungeon suddenly made a lot more sense. Chapter 72. That which will not bend. Law was sitting at his desk, doing his best to be busy. A task made difficult by the relative lack of work at the moment. Most of his job was system bug hunting. Something that would likely be down for a day or two since a new patch was inbound. His side work being a bit on the sparse side wasn't helping matters. When Law wasn't doing systems work, he was giving omens or summoning heroes. It sounded cooler than it was because his part was just the tail end of a longer process. First, he ran a few checks to ensure the talent scouts and related deities had filled everything out correctly. If they didn't, he sent them back for correction. If they did, he okayed them. Though he wouldn't ever admit it, Law envied Good quite a bit. They actually interacted with summoned heroes. Of course, it was more work, but at least it was interesting. Thinking of Good, Law glanced over at his coworker briefly. Usually, they'd have made small talk or taken a break together at some point. Instead, Law was trying very hard not to draw Good's attention, which was unusual in the extreme. Good was someone everybody loved and wanted to be close to. Everyone but evil, but that was a diametric opposition. It couldn't be helped. Despite that, Law was pretty sure evil liked Good too, even if they couldn't admit it. Or at least he had been until recent events. Good had poisoned someone and threw their former co-worker neutrality to the wolves in the process. That the poisoned someone in question was evil made it almost seem sensible. Almost. It hadn't been so long ago Good wouldn't have even considered doing such a thing. To act in a way that couldn't hold up to the cold light of day. Law tried to remember when exactly they'd start to change. He couldn't honestly pick a particular moment, it had come on gradually, or he'd outright missed the signs. Law, could you help me? I'm having trouble figuring something out, Good asked sweetly. Law hesitated but, like usual, couldn't say no in the end. So he grabbed an apple and some water and headed over. What's got you flummoxed? Law asked, pretending to be calm. They hadn't talked about the incident, not really. Good had just giddily informed him they succeeded at the order they'd both received. When he'd asked how, that was when they casually explained how they'd created the distractions that let them get into the other office unnoticed. Well, I think I've finally traced the issue I was talking about. You know, the one where fate lines were disappearing out of the divine domains. The trouble is that it's linked to a dungeon, Good explained as they pointed to the offending item on their screen. It was a dungeon core's profile, the font of the interface read on a field of black that felt like it was dripping the longer Law looked at it. This is an evil account, Law observed aloud. Though for whose benefit, he wasn't sure. Clearly, Good couldn't have missed that they were working on an account that didn't belong to them, let alone an evil one. Oh, yeah, after I managed to get that USB into their system, I gained access, Good replied calmly. Law nodded numbly just to have something to do. He'd had no idea what the end result would be, but there was no way someone could have legitimately ordered it for that kind of goal. Admins weren't supposed to trespass into each other's domains. Just getting to Evil's desk had required going through neutrality. How could a dungeon affect a fate line? Law asked. He knew the lines were essentially the most likely path a life would take. Technically all beings had them, but the gods didn't typically bother with those not linked to heroes or the priesthood. Even then, they usually filtered them so only the upper tiers ever got their attention. Magic, divine, or secular, could destabilize a fate line, but it didn't happen often. Even then, it just became unreadable rather than moving totally out of the divine system. Law hadn't been able to figure out what caused several to seemingly vanish despite the associated beings still being alive. That a dungeon was responsible made no sense. I'm not sure, but I put trackers on lines of interest. 4 of them disappeared when they came in contact with a dungeon. So it has to be the cause, Good said, looking satisfied with their logic. Law tilted his head, not so easily convinced. Did the other ones? Law asked. I wasn't tracking those. All of the data disappeared when they did, Good said dismissively. Law sighed, it was sloppy reasoning. Not that it was exactly unusual in and of itself. Good had always been a little too gung-ho when they thought they were right. The fact that one instance proved nothing probably not even occurring to them. Law felt like shit as he did it, but started mentally cataloging all of the rules Good was breaking. He was going to have to file a report to the higher UPS. This kind of thing couldn't be ignored. Are you sure they disappeared? It would look the same if they were reassigned, Law asked, wanting to draw things out. Unfortunately, he would have to work on the report once he returned to his desk. A reassignment was the only relevant alternative to Good's assumption that the fate lines were outright gone. As if it was a party of heroes under Stromholt. I doubt they had a sudden crisis of faith. He's an excellent deity. The dungeon must have done something, Good said dismissively. Law flinched at the deity's name, unable to think of but aware of a similar one. Stromholt was good and Law aligned last he checked. Those kinds of deities did tend to draw loyal followers. If you say so. I honestly don't know much about dungeons, possibly less than you. What did you need a hand with? Law asked, wanting to keep the discussion moving. He needed to know what Good was trying to do for the report. That's just the thing. It's more of a systems issue. I can find the dungeon's profile and the physical location on the local map, but I can't locate it on the server, Good explained. Then it's probably on a sub-server, but that's not Evil's style, Law said, swallowing involuntarily at the end. Ooh, I should have thought of that. You're right though, that's not how Evil normally does things, Good cooed. Law nodded, but his mind was on other things. Like Good had ultimately done, Law had recently tried to plant a USB into Evil's system. He'd used harassing neutrality with paperwork as a cover. However, Law had to admit to himself he had wanted to bother neutrality as a kind of petty retribution. Neutrality had ignored Good trying to befriend them and transferred offices, which meant all of his work had fallen on Law. It was petty, but between his crush on Good and general distaste for neutrality, it had been easy to give in. Not that neutrality had really done anything. Though in some ways that had been as much a part of the problem as anything. Neutrality just kind of took up space most of the time and barely spoke. Not that it was particularly riveting when they did deign to speak. Law really had no idea how someone could think their tropical fish would be an entertaining topic to anyone but themselves. He sighed, just remembering those stories was painful. Almost as bad as when one of the managers cornered him with baby photos or golf tall tales. This Evil's pretty different from the old one, Law offered. He'd wanted to give neutrality a hard time, but he hadn't actually been happy about tampering with evil's system. Of course, it was an order, so he couldn't refuse it, but that didn't make it right. There were also far more straightforward ways of achieving the same result. Law was pretty sure he'd seen a post-it with an evil intern's login stuck to a screen in passing. He could have just snagged it if he knew that was what their manager was after. Not in any way that matters, and they're dead by now anyway, Good said dismissively. That gave Law pause. The last time he'd seen evil, he'd been riveted on Ruby Lips dripping venom as he was driven back. His personal space invaded, his conduct torn apart, and not a single rule was broken even as it shook him to the core. This evil was a rules-adept punk rock nightmare that was best left to its own self-destructive vices. The old evil had been slick and corporate. Always a glib deflection on their tongue and lying like they breathed. Law and Good had spent more than one afternoon groaning about some bullshit they'd gotten up to that rolled downhill and screwed them over too. Good had actually run to a vending machine, bought crappy cupcakes, and made party hats out of printer paper the day they heard that asshole was dead. Law felt sick to his stomach as he thought of that. Of the Good he used to know and the fun they'd had once upon a time. If he were honest with himself, the one sitting in the chair next to him felt like a stranger. "What are you doing?" Law asked. He hadn't been paying much attention to what Good was up to. He set his drink and snack down to lean over and get a better look. "I found the dungeon, it was moved to a sandbox. It looks like evil was having some fun," Good chirped. "Okay, but what did you do?" Law asked. There was an unlabeled loading bar on the screen. "Oh, well, I'm going to overwrite it and purge all the memory data," Good explained. Law was struck utterly dumb by the revelation. They didn't access each other's systems, and they sure as order didn't tamper with agents of different alignments. Really, he wasn't even sure how Good was able to use evil's login at all. Looking at it was giving him a headache. Touching it would have been agony. Good Law started only to be cut off by a sudden hiss. Good had picked up his drink and taken a sip only for it to burn their lip. Aquavita was a product of the same world that produced the ambrosia apples Good had poisoned evil with. To Good, it should have been nothing more than a pleasantly cool cup of water. "Oh fuck," Law said flatly as the meaning of what he was seeing sunk in. Chapter 73. Strange Happenings. When the hero party went to sleep, I decided to check in on the pair they'd left on the surface. The human woman, and what I found out was a Lepusan after some research. Standing relatively short for her kind at 6 feet, she was an interesting blend of human and rabbit-like features. One of the many species attributed to the goddess Laurel, whom the mountain range was named after. Her face was human primarily in appearance, though the construction of the nose was broader and flatter than a human's, with leathery moist skin at the end of it. She had rabbit ears in a strawberry blonde matching the fine fur covering her head and what I could see of her legs. Those were the least human aspect of her aside from the ears. Her legs were digitigrade and ended in rabbit paws. I'd have been lying if I tried to pretend she wasn't one of my major points of interest. I had built a temple for Laurel, but was pretty curious about what someone who actually worshipped her would think of it. So the idea of baiting the pair over for a look as a test case was deeply tempting. The pair was sitting in the farmhouse sharing a lovely dinner, courtesy of Alim's fake family. There was an odd tension between them. The human woman had trouble moving around in candlelight but resented the Lepusan trying to help her. It had a weird lover's quarrel kind of atmosphere to it. "Myra, you really need to rest more. I doubt we'll have an easy time in the desert after this," the Lepusan woman said, as I spied on them with my security feed. I tilted my head, a little confused by her solicitous attitude toward the woman. I hadn't missed the collar around her neck or the matching key this Myra had. That did not sit well with me. That I could hear them talking also sunk in. That was different, to say the least. It also lacked a ready explanation. I did a quick check and found I still couldn't hear anything when I looked in on the hero party. I put that on my list of weird things to figure out eventually. I don't want to rest. We should have left already. We have to leave in the morning. The others might turn back, and if they do, I don't think I'll be able to resist the control, Myra replied. That had 300% of my attention. Hey, Aaron, can you cast a sleep spell? I asked as an idea occurred to me. Yes. He said, not looking up from whatever he was working on. We were the only ones left in the necropolis's bleachers. Everyone else had filtered out after the heroes' party had settled into a safe zone for the night. Not that I could blame them. Aaron remaining felt less like a conscious decision and more him just forgetting where he was. I might have some shenanigans for you and Chris later, I replied. I had an idea, but I wasn't sure about it yet. Aaron made an irritated click but didn't stop what he was doing or leave. Myra and Hetcha had been locked in a staring contest while I chatted. I waited for someone to give in and hopefully provide an exposition dump. We'll leave in the morning if you rest properly, Hetcha said finally. Predictably they didn't deign to enlighten me as to what the fuck was going on any further and went to bed. Together. Well, that did explain the tension, if not the collar. I closed the security feed. I wasn't keen on getting an eye full of questionable romance. Hey, Aaron, I called to get his attention. It took a moment, but he looked up, irritable. I want to know what's up with that collar. So I figure you can cast sleep on them so they can't wake up and examine it. Take it off if you can safely. Maybe figure out if they have anything worth copying on them, I said. Aaron looked like he was going to protest, then seemed to change his mind and become thoughtful. Do I really need to take Chris? Aaron asked sourly. I had to fight down a chuckle. Aaron objecting to someone like that felt like a pot and kettle kind of thing. Most dungeon denizens weren't terribly fond of either of them. Look, he has a particular set of skills, I started, not making it easier to keep from laughing. So put up with him for a bit, and maybe you'll get something interesting to research, I added quickly. Aaron looked away but not to his book, pouting from what I could tell. Reluctantly he nodded in the end. Thank you, I said after I floated over to give him a pat on the shoulder. He didn't flinch but looked surprised, if not outright startled. Sorry, that's not something you're okay with? I asked. I'd assumed in Henry's case and didn't want to make that mistake again. It could have been that I'd offered the gesture, but it might have been the gesture itself or that Aaron didn't like to be touched at all. I don't even understand what it was. I thought you were going to hit me, but... That was a sorry showing, Aaron said, perplexed. That was a shoulder pat. It's a friendly gesture where I'm from. It's not meant to hurt or anything, I explained. That a shoulder pat didn't translate hadn't really occurred to me. Aaron cocked his head to the side as his confusion deepened. Then when you put your arm around someone? Aaron asked. A hug, usually. Which is also friendly and not meant to hurt either, I explained. It was a little too simple, but the nuance of touch wasn't easily explained. Of course, you could be a dick and make either gesture hurt, but that wasn't the intended use, as it were. I see. So you're attempting to be affectionate when you do things like that, Aaron summarized. I flinched a little internally. That sounds like a bit more than I was going for, but it wasn't exactly wrong. Yeah, though I'll stop if you prefer. Like I said, it's supposed to be nice, not uncomfortable or painful, I clarified. I don't particularly care. I just found it odd. I suppose I should go find Chris if we're going to fulfill our mission, Aaron said, flatly changing topics. Yep, sounds good. I'll put you both directly outside the farmhouse once you explain things to him, I said simply. No sense in making things stay awkward longer than they needed to be. It didn't take long for Aaron to return with Chris in tow. Chris was excited to have a mission and only mildly disappointed it wasn't an assassination like he was first hoping. I observed once I placed them outside the farmhouse but was pleasantly surprised. They both behaved in what I was willing to call a professional manner. I zoned out once Myra and Hetcha were put under the sleep spell. My head had started to hurt, though it wasn't severe, just a faint throbbing pulse just at the edge of my awareness. It was honestly more distracting than painful. Also, there was a flicking in my vision. Something like symbols that felt familiar, but made me feel nauseous if I tried to place them. 42. Henry's concerned voice broke through my thoughts. I found him right in front of me, looking panicked. A hand on my cheek and the other on my shoulder as he peered at me. "Oh. Hi." I sputtered, not sure what the fuck was going on. There was no way he'd gotten this close without me noticing, even using a movement ability. Something was wrong. "You didn't answer when I called out or even shook you," Henry said, seeming relieved but still worried. I was just lost in thought," I lied, though I couldn't explain why. I shouldn't have lied, but the more I tried to think of what the truth was, the more it slipped from my grasp. "That was more than lost," Henry countered. "Well, oh fuck," I said, realizing I had 3 missed messages and 2 missed calls. All of them were from Aaron and Chris. What?" Henry asked, worried. Chris and Aaron were outside, but I didn't get their messages. "I need to," I cut off at the sound of the mirror rippling. Aaron and Chris walked in through it. "We walked back," Chris said tersely as he walked past me toward the necropolis. "Like a rude little shit." I felt something as I saw his retreating back that I wasn't accustomed to. Anger. Not at the fact that he was rude, but that he dared to feel anything at all. As if his ability to be a petulant little bastard weren't a gift he was unworthy of. "Aaron, this isn't right," Henry said sharply. I looked at him and saw stats, flaws. Everything weighed and measured and found wanting because why should I accept something less than perfect into my service? This was my domain, and it would be as I desired. I could see it taking shape, the dungeon I was meant to have. An intricate labyrinth of breathtaking beauty to entomb all who trespassed. One full of monsters who would do as they were meant to rather than behave in the frivolous manner of the living. A fucking murder hole as silent as the grave to go insane inside of while I toiled alone for eternity or until my core shattered. "Fuck that," I growled, hands clawing at my own head. Chris was mad because I'd fucked him over, and Henry was fine how he was. I'd take the messy imperfection of good company over the alternative. No, not quite my own head. I was clawing at something, no, someone. They looked remarkably like me and fought back ferociously. Only that vision shimmered, and I realized I was on my back, unmoving despite the vision of a struggle. "I have no idea what's going on," I heard Aaron say in a hushed and worried voice. It sounded strange coming from him. "Her flames turned red earlier. Look, they're normal again," Henry said. I had a moment of vertigo as I looked at him as he leaned over me and from a higher angle. Like I was seeing him both with my orbs and from the security feed without the interface. He was holding me with an arm behind me, supporting my head and neck. His other hand was entwined with mine. Aaron was kneeling on the other side, looking confused and more than a little helpless. "I'm something awake," I offered. Henry helped me sit up, and I found he and Aaron weren't the only ones present. Really, it looked like the entire population of the necropolis had shown up. I wasn't sure what to say but was cut off by an unexpected sight. The hero party lined up at the mirror, seeming to look in curiously. Chapter 74. Meanwhile, Lillian was the first one to awaken in the morning, as always. It was her habit since her days in the convent orphanage to rise and pray before doing more mundane tasks. Alone for a few moments, she studied Reiner as he slept, her hand momentarily hovering over his belt. The urge to steal his sword and throw it down a well passed quickly. Reiner was the second one up. He made breakfast and checked his equipment, amiably smiling at Lillian in a way he never showed when the others were awake. Stoicism didn't exactly suit him. He was young and lacked the kind of gravitas needed for it to look more than stiff or even a little comical. Andrea, being used to a noble's schedule, was the third one up and quickly shook Mina out of her blankets. As if somehow that would hide that she was clearly rising late herself. Mina whined in her native language for a few moments before properly waking up. Each shared a despondent look before they all flinched and forgot what they were thinking about. The plan for today is to press on and see how far we can get before nightfall, Reiner said cheerlessly. Of course, it wasn't actually a plan, or at least not one worthy of the name, but none of them commented. They managed to make it down several floors where the stone was punched with holes that made it look like cheese or demented lace. Throughout the area, they could hear sharp clicks and strange cries echoing around them. The beasts and monsters present were mostly insects still with a scattering of moles and bats. Ugh, why don't they all just come at us? Andrea moaned, her stamina depleting with every fight as they ran for the stairs to the next level. She was better in target-rich shorter fights. Hit-and-run affairs wore her out. Reiner setting a pace that made it impossible for her to rest did not help with the issue. Right. Mina agreed in a rare moment of camaraderie. She was a medium defense fighter, and all the walking in her heavy gear was wearing her down. But, despite their complaints, Reiner didn't slow down. On the next floor down, they came to a room with 3 archways. One on each wall with a metal plaque on a stone base in the center of the room. Lil, can you read it? Reiner asked, eyeing it curiously. Lillian studied it for a few moments but shook her head. It's not a language I recognize, she said simply. She cast a look in Mina's direction, who came over with a sigh. Lillian could understand a variety of languages, but Mina could understand any language she heard. She also could read a fair number, though that ability was hit or miss, unlike translating the spoken. What is the greatest virtue of sapient beings? Mina read aloud. Compassion, faith, logic, she continued, reading the words inscribed above the entryways. Faith, animals can't understand and worship, Lillian said without giving it more than a moment of thought. Compassion. Andrea offered, though she didn't give any backing argument. Isn't the question kind of weird, though? Mina asked as she reread it. Something about how it was worded bothered her, but she couldn't think of why. If this really is a ruin, it should have been constructed by the gods, Lillian offered to back up her own assertion. Right, and those gods were the ones who made humans, Mina said as she mulled it over. The use of sapient beings just didn't sit right with her. Well, we should honor our patron. I choose faith, Reiner said without enthusiasm. Beside him, Lillian nodded, satisfied with his answer. Andrea didn't seem to care that she'd lost, but Mina frowned more intensely. The reason for his choice sounded cynical to her. A jab of pain, and she forgot her objection, walking through the faith archway along with the others. Traversing the maze that lay beyond the faith archway was odd. More puzzles appeared, but the answers seemed almost mocking, and the choices didn't seem to matter. Mina was disturbed when she accidentally pressed the wrong switch at one juncture. She quickly flipped it back, then picked the one she'd meant to, but the same door opened. Reiner, this isn't. Mina started to voice a warning. A jag of pain stopped her, and when she found the party's eyes on her, she struggled to think of something to say. This isn't a romantic setting, but maybe we could take a break? Mina asked. Lillian and Andrea looked at her with ill-concealed jealousy, but Reiner didn't really react. We'll take one when we get a bit further in, Reiner said. It was the same thing he'd said since they'd first entered the floor. Mina wanted to scream, but nothing came out as pain washed over her, and she nearly buckled to her knees. Mina? You look pale. Are you all right? Reiner asked, rushing to her side. Genuine concern showed in his expression as his hand went to her forehead. He'd grown up in the same orphanage as Lillian. So he wasn't a stranger to people suddenly taking sick. Just a headache, Mina said, confused by why everyone looked worried. That's good, can't be too careful, Reiner said, his usual smile returning. Mina smiled back, and the party continued on. Traps and monsters attempted to waylay them, but they eventually made it out of the maze. Instead of the plain room with a fountain they expected, they were greeted by a beautiful chamber reminiscent of a chapel. Candles lit it softly, and a sweet smoky incense filled the air. A life-size statue stood on an altar amidst the candles. Its form was vaguely human but like a half-melted form rather than a likeness. The party was drawn to the altar. Each of them stared at the statue with a smile as their pupils began to blow wide. Reiner, Lillian, and Andrea all saw an amalgam of gods and people dear to them morphing endlessly. Mina saw Jesus and Buddha mingling with her mother. All four came forward to kneel without question before the altar. Only Mina felt a pang of dread as she noticed she'd knelt down on a big red X. A metallic click rang out, and a moment later, the party was sliding quickly down a greased chute, all of them screaming as religious visions assailed them. Drugged and exhausted, the group was ill-prepared to deal with the monstrous bat boss room they found at the bottom. Some of the creatures they fought turned into true winged horrors before their eyes. Others spoke incomprehensible words of prophecy amid the shrieks that filled the air. Somewhere in the melee Reiner had picked up a sword. No one else was terribly interested in looking at it. Most of the prior fights had dropped the odd minor item or a bit of coin. This was definitely the first substantial reward they'd found. After the ordeal though, no one but Reiner cared and he clung to it desperately as they fled. Luck allowed them to escape to the safe area mostly intact, though they were all tattered and bloodied by the ordeal. Covered in stinging wounds and breathless, they all collapsed in a heap. Like the prior safe areas, this one was just a room with a fountain, a few benches, and a teleport circle. Andrea and Mina eyed the teleport circle and cast hopeful glances at Reiner, which he ignored. "Everyone rest before we try the next section," Reiner said, dashing the girls' hopes. Knowing arguing was useless, Mina used the fountain to clean herself off. The others were less fussy and slumped on benches to get off the floor. The next floor wasn't easier, and the party began to struggle as they fought more brutal monsters. Tired and dull from the long trudge, it wasn't strange that their vigilance relaxed, forgetting traps were just as dangerous, if not as common as monsters. A pressure plate groaned, and the party was assailed by a hail of darts. Lillian was hit by a stray one but most hit her shield harmlessly. Mina was at the edge of the trap and managed to get away quickly enough. Unfortunately, Andrea and Reiner were wrong-footed, ill-equipped, and unlucky enough to be in the middle when the trap went off. Reiner ducked behind Andrea to use her as a shield. She was struck broadside and started to collapse. With the hail of darts done, Reiner picked her up and carried her out of the trap's range straight to Lillian for treatment. Mina stepped up to help, obviously worried despite her usual enmity. Reiner's build was more robust physically than Andrea's, he'd have been hurt, but she was in mortal peril. None of them commented on what Reiner had done. As if it hadn't happened. "Reiner, we can't keep going like this. I can only heal so much," Lillian said despite wincing as she did. "We'll take a proper rest at the next stairs room," Reiner agreed, flinching. The girls walked ahead of him, Mina and Lillian helping to support a still wobbly Andrea. Reiner reached for his sword belt, hands shaking as he tried to take it off. His eyes screwed tight, and his body tensed. Despite the struggle, he withdrew his hand in the end and walked quickly to catch up to the girls. True to his word, when they came to the room with the fountain that led to the stairs, Reiner called for a full rest. He also set a more leisurely pace through the next set of levels. It wasn't until they encountered a room full of soil that things really got tricky again. The soft footing threatened to turn an ankle, and Andrea's heeled shoes were quickly discarded after they sank in. After a few moments, moles came swimming up through the soil as gracefully as fish. The smallest of them was half of Andrea's height, who was the shortest in the party. The largest one towered over Reiner, who was the tallest. They were formidable, well-coordinated enemies. Under pressure from the monster's attack, the party broke its former formation and assembled into something different. Andrea led, her quick footwork and light blows not enough to do serious injury, but enough to keep the moles off balance. Mina followed her up with Lillian, both wearing the most armor in the party. Reiner stood paralyzed at the back for a few precious moments, struggling to reach for his pack but finally winning out and drawing a crossbow. With him to keep the pressure up and help Andrea, they were able to win out. It was still a grueling battle given the mole's toughness, however. When they made it to the next fountain room, they were leaning on each other and laughing. Not a mirthful sound but with the exuberance of simply being alive. They made camp and slept a whole night, the girls waking to the smell of breakfast. Reiner served but had already eaten, more interested in the spoils of the boss fight than chatting. The blade's enchantable, Lillian said with reverence. She'd examined the dropped loot blade once she was done eating. Mina and Andrea were both eyeing the teleport pad, hopefully. Reiner didn't miss them looking and smiled. Yeah, that was too much, Reiner acknowledged. He stood up, walking toward the pad to everyone's relief, only to be assailed by vertigo as pain slammed down on him like an iron rod. The girls were similarly afflicted, and for several moments, they were frozen as if in a silent scream. When they came out of it, they knew that they needed to continue on for the greater good. Yesterday was too much. I shouldn't have set such a fast pace in the first place, and we still didn't take enough rest breaks. I apologize for that, Reiner said gently with a weak, forced smile. The girls nodded along with his words. Today, we'll be more careful about it, Reiner said, and they all nodded together. The descent into the lower levels didn't go smoothly. Still, between longer breaks and a slower pace, the party was able to keep going. Reiner fought to keep using his crossbow, but reverted back to his sword before long. The group's formation likewise changed back to the standard one centered on Reiner. Going by the pattern from the prior sections, the party expected a boss fight at the end of the third level. Instead, they found another fountain room and a fourth level waiting for them. Ha ha ha! Mina let out a groan. Everyone else laughed or sighed as the tension of facing another boss broke. They descended to the fourth floor and pushed through its defenses. A much more complicated endeavor as the traps increased in frequency and lethality. They'd never had a rogue in the group, Stronghold despising the class. Instead of a clear boss area, they came to what looked like a cave-in. Beyond it lay what looked like an ancient structure. Proof positive in their minds they were in a ruin of some kind. Mina looked over the structure and felt an unsettling sense of familiarity. Like the riddle of the arches, it resonated oddly with her. This ruin reminded her subtly of home. Nothing about it was precisely like any culture's architecture she'd seen but more like an artful combination of several of them. It felt like a cleverly done forgery rather than something actually different. Should we rest? Reiner asked as he looked around. There wasn't any apparent danger but it didn't look like one of the rest areas either. None of those rooms had looked much alike but they still had common elements and showed up after a hard fight. Seeing one had started to become something he associated with relative safety. Maybe this isn't the final section. There might be another puzzle, Lillian offered. Well, let's take a look around then. If you don't find anything, meet back up at that mirror, Reiner decided. After a fruitless search, they all ended up in front of the silver mirror. Unlike the murky ones they were accustomed to, this one was clear enough to see themselves in eerie detail. The only thing marring the mirror's perfect finish was a line of tarnished text. Life takes many paths, but in the end, there is only one fate. Memento mori, Mina supplied, stumbling when she realized she hadn't translated the final words. The entire sentence had been in English, with the last words in Latin. Mina turned pale, unnerved by the out-of-place line of text. Beside her, Andrea had been checking her makeup and applying lipstick instead of listening. What? Andrea shrieked, pointing at the mirror as the lipstick fell from her hand. The party looked and found their images were withering. As if the sands of time gushed instead of flowed in the mirror. They aged and rotted to nothing but bones and dust in mere moments. The party stood frozen as they witnessed the horrid sight of their own death and decay. However, the skeletal remains of themselves were not so inclined to be still. They stepped from the mirror with weapons poised to attack. Chapter 75. Self and Others. Though the skeletons were more concerned with me, a party did go forward to meet the heroes. My vision swam as it seemed to change angle randomly. Sometimes I was looking at Henry, others I was in the cavern watching the fight. Despite their initial moment of horror and surprise, the heroes' party still fell into combat formation. The skeletons enchanted by the mirror looked like their desiccated twins except for Reiner's. A proper bowman had gone forward instead of a swordsman. I knew his name, but I couldn't think of it and couldn't remember why I should have ever bothered giving a skeleton a name. The cleric should have been an asset against the undead. Or at least the part of me that had once likely been obsessed with tabletop RPGs assumed that. This one didn't seem to be much use, however. She looked like she was panicking. "Get your shit together," the fighter girl shouted, fending off a blow that would have ended the cleric. "All right," the cleric said. Skeletons were weak, but the party wasn't a match for my creatures. The only upside of letting them play their ridiculous games was excellent combat proficiency. Mistress sent us out to check the pair that stayed behind. They were both wearing enslavement items. The seer girl had a more insidious type. She might not have known she was being controlled, I could hear Aaron explaining though I couldn't see him. The spell that Alim had described came back to me. The party was being controlled. The strange drawing I'd made suddenly clarified in my mind. The magic originated from the boy's sword and connected to something on each of them. It didn't matter. They were my prey, and I would have the points they provided to grow stronger from. An image of a grand palace to grow mad in assailed me. Of course, it fucking mattered. Someone had put those wretched control items on a bunch of kids. Fuck them. I looked up at Henry, uncertain of why. Vertigo or something like it robbing me of any sense of direction. He might have still been cradling me on the ground, or we might have been on the ceiling for all I knew. He wasn't looking at me just now, eyes riveted with disgust on the fight. The party couldn't cope with the onslaught of a group fighting to their own strengths instead of following an imposed pattern. As their cohesion broke, Reiner used Andrea as a shield to keep from being slaughtered. Archers were supposed to fight from behind cover. Preferably at a distance rather than directly in the fray. He should have been acting as a sniper, not a melee combatant. "I'm okay, go," I said, reaching up to touch the side of Henry's skull to get his attention. He looked at me with confused reluctance. "Go," I repeated. This time Henry nodded, getting to his feet and heading for the mirror. Every part of me screamed that what I'd done was wrong. That I didn't owe the sheep who came willingly to the slaughter. I didn't know if I was standing or hanging, but I forced my body into a vertical position. Unable to hover but still managing something approaching decent posture. Around me, the skeletons backed up, observing me curiously. I knew Chris was somewhere in their numbers. I wanted to see him but couldn't focus well enough to pick him out of the crowd. Beyond the mirror, Reiner panicked. He shoved Andrea into the path of a blow from her counterpart. She was stabbed brutally in his place. The party, seeing what happened, froze. In that moment of weakness, Lillian, the cleric, was struck dead. A dull thud from a mace was the only sound in the cave for a long moment. "Retreat!" Reiner shouted. He tried to strike at Andrea's counterpart through her. A fundamental mistake, skeletons weren't easy to injure, and his blow would lose too much force to be helpful. Miriam, who'd stepped out as Andrea's counterpart, was a chevalier just like the girl. A proud creature who prided herself on her ability as a duelist and adhered to a concept of honor. She cast the girl aside to safety, allowing herself to be knocked off balance. It was a fatal decision. Reiner wasn't a good swordsman, but he followed up properly. His blow struck Miriam's skull and shattered it. I didn't doubt she'd feel proud of the choice when she respawned. Andrea spun as she fell, grasping her side and unable to even think to break her landing. She never touched the ground, Henry appearing in a crackling halo of blue energy to catch her. With care, he laid her down gently on the floor. Reiner stumbled back, a look of horror on his face. I wasn't sure if it was for what he'd done or the appearance of a new foe. It honestly didn't matter to me anyway. Henry ignored Reiner, taking hold of a silver chain around Andrea's neck, and snapped it. The control item, I assumed. I watched in fascination as Henry stood up fluidly, discarding the necklace with a careless flick. Now Henry regarded Reiner with open disgust. He'd seen what the boy had done as well as everyone else in the necropolis's bleachers. Yet, despite that, he still executed a proper bow with a flourish of his sword. Unlike the boy, Henry had style as well as skill and manners. I wanted to laugh. From a technical perspective, a chevalier would be a bad match up against a heavy swordsman. Despite that, I felt like it would never be wise to bet against Henry. Reiner went pale then and slashed wildly. The ill-suited sword passed through empty air as Henry quick-stepped out of the way. All that was left was a trail of blue energy just to the left of where Reiner had expected him to be. Reiner! Mina, the remaining uninjured girl, screamed. The boy tried desperately to land a blow, but it was useless. As he fumbled past, Henry slashed the exposed back of his leg. The incomplete armor betrayed him. Distracted, Mina was taken by surprise by an arrow from Reiner's skeletal counterpart. Andrea ran over to her side, tearing the necklace from her friend's neck before attempting first aid. Henry held up a hand to forestall another attack from the skeletons. When he glanced toward the mirror, I nodded though I knew he couldn't see me. I didn't owe anyone who decided to come and risk their lives for treasure. However, that didn't mean I would casually accept when someone sent others to die against their will. Really though, what could it possibly matter how they came to my dungeon? Points were points, after all. So why not savor the gift instead of questioning it? I felt sick, worse than when I'd coughed up the Boon. The thought didn't feel like my own, but I couldn't explain why. As I tried to refuse it, 10 arguments for it sprang to life from the pool of knowledge that made up my memories. I'd mostly cobbled together my views based on what I happened to think of first when considering a subject. As a result, there wasn't any real sense of connection to an idea. Not until after I'd thought about it and made a decision. A shiver ran through my body. I didn't have an express reason for anything I did or refused to do. Was that something anyone would call a personality? Did I have one before I became a core? Or was the idea that I'd been human just something I'd made up to explain things to myself? Was this what it felt like to exist as I was without the system's suppression function to stop me from panicking? Despite the fact I didn't need to breathe, I felt like I did and couldn't. Chest hitching in mock motion, my vision blurred and darkened. My last clear thought was that I was falling. An interesting thing to know after spending so much time uncertain of up and down. I didn't care much about the return of my sense of direction. Someone other than Henry was catching me. Someone with violet jewels who was shouting. I couldn't recognize them, and that broke my heart a little for some reason. Around me, the world shattered. Fissures ran from the floor up the walls to the ceiling. Then, breaking away in shards, it fell into a starry void. Every part of me was in pain, worse than a raid migraine or even when I'd coughed up the Boon. My form was hard to see in the darkness, but I thought I could just make out an outline. One that suggested I was seeing double. The trouble was that every time I saw it, the pain intensified. Finally, with a sensation like skin peeling from a sunburn, something sloughed off from my pseudo-flesh. I couldn't see what it was clearly in the dark. All that stood out was a pair of burning red orbs. Chapter 76. Sister Simulacra. Staring into ruby flames, I understood I was supposed to yield. It was a command resonating in my very core. The pain and my sense of responsibility would end the moment I did. Another would take my place, and the burden would fall from me. Eyes of magma and a hissing bark of laughter flashed through my mind. Not everything was a burden, not all responsibility was unwelcomed. Give in. Something hissed. Small pleasures didn't make up for what I had to do. The choices that had been forced on me. The things I would be held accountable for having done. If I gave in, then they would no longer be my sins. A children's book for a child who'd never been allowed to be one. Violet jewels rolling in disdain that thinly veiled uncertainty and fear. I might not have been given much of a choice, but I'd chosen. That would not change, nor would I be absolved of it even in surrender. I shouldn't be, even if I could. You shouldn't be able to, a double-layered feminine voice raged. Hands on my neck and red fire burning with hatred and frustration. Nothing would change that mattered. One dungeon master was indistinguishable from another. All would be well. Blue jewels shining from within bone as gentle words were spoken haltingly. Skilled hands picking out delicate embroidery instead of slitting throats. Laughter from creatures who'd been denied voice. I didn't know who was trying to get me to submit. I didn't care why they were. All I knew was that they could go fuck themselves. I pushed back against the pain and my own fear with everything I had. I struggled against the other creature with desperation and fury. I would not give up what was mine. I would not fail those I'd called to me. I hadn't died gently the first time. I would not submit sweetly now. We fell, thrashing and scrabbling at each other through a star-blighted void. Above us the world or eternity shook as powers struggled for dominion. Runes flare and die as keys clatter beneath them. He is beautiful. His is the domain of the sought for rest, the surrender of the mind. One who rules in the silence of an unending scream. He has a letter opener sharper than Occam's razor and will gut the beast of order which has too long languished in sloth. The other is one born of books and rules and good intentions. Often overlooked, rarely understood, never loved in return. It is not enough that it is written. It must also be felt, for no law is just that gives no consideration for circumstance. He abhors absolutes, knowing they bring nothing but loss. Yet he loved that which aspired to such heights. There, upon a field of letters they struggle. The creature of order is petty, jealous, and he is fighting, despite every cut bleeding his own heart. This thing which wears his love's face knows its advantage, knows his weakness. There is blood and death, and I see no more. What the fuck? I shouted. Mainly because I had no idea what else to do. What I'd just witnessed felt like upgrade sickness on steroids. The starless darkness without a sense of direction was the less jarring part of whatever was going on. In front of me hovered something with burning red fire for eyes. I took a wild guess it was another DM, probably the one who'd seemed to ooze from me not so long ago. She was looking at me, but not saying anything. Like a creep. "What's your name?" I asked. Time had passed, though I wasn't sure how much. My body ached terribly, but the sense of tearing and wrongness was gone at least. I took it as an improvement. I tried opening the system, but nothing happened. "Why would I need such a thing?" she asked harshly. Her whisper-quiet voice carried and filled the void around us before disappearing. "I'm going to call you 24, I informed 24. She hissed irritably in response, which didn't displease me any. On the contrary, given that she'd just oozed out of me, it struck me as rude that she wasn't offering any kind of explanation or introduction. "As if it matters, you've ruined everything," she growled at me. Hearing a voice like my own was a bit jarring. I hadn't realized how creepy it really was from an outsider's perspective. "What's everything in this context?" I asked. I didn't genuinely expect an answer, but there wasn't a point in not asking. Your dungeon would have been mine, and I'd have remade it correctly. What kind of dungeon master even wants monsters that think in the first place? 24 snarled. The kind that doesn't want to go insane living in a hole in the ground surrounded by murder drones. I offered. I heard a growl, and there was another long pause. It could have been seconds or eons in this strange place we'd found ourselves. "Then you have a death wish," 24 retorted finally. "What do you get out of doing the opposite, aside from loneliness?" I demanded. 24 didn't respond this time. Well, with a charming personality like yours, at least I don't have to worry the crew won't recognize an imposter. Not even if you shave the goatee, I said, mostly to be irritating. I had no practical idea of what 24 looked like aside from the ruby color of her flames. I was picturing a caricature of me with a mustache fit for twirling and goatee anyway. While I was making noise to fill the oppressive silence, I was mentally running through every possible command I could think of. On top of not getting access to the system properly, my display didn't show the time or any usual icons. Unresponsive glyphs floated in their place. Wow, couldn't resist, could you? Nerd, she spat. I felt a sting of anger followed by a realization. Takes a nerd to recognize the reference, I shot back. So, what exactly are you? Aside from an incompetent doppelganger, I asked to keep 24 talking. Inventory, I thought, and a strange glyph appeared, but nothing else. I'd expected it and tried focusing, remembering what the proper icon looked like. I imagined the interface opened and did my best to remember the contents. For a moment, my item box wobbled into existence. In the next, it shimmered out before I could do anything. No amount of picturing it got it to appear a second time. I am what you will be when your weakness is gone, 24 spat. My sense of humor is a weakness. I asked with genuine curiosity. I did not understand the math on that one. Everything about you is a weakness. Those monsters you're so concerned about? They're only like that because you assumed they would be, 24 snarled. Wait, what? I asked, taken by surprise. Other DMs get proper, what did you call them? Murder drones? Obedient and programmable monsters, 42 said with disdain. Some of what she'd said tracked with things I already knew. The skeletons had mentioned not being able to talk under other DMs being definitely because of me wasn't something I thought would ever be confirmed. I tried to think of anything the difference could be traced back to. Nothing sprang to mind at first, not until I remembered the first time the hounds talked to me. I hadn't expected that, but I'd looked in their profile and found that they could communicate after the fact. While I couldn't be sure that was it was all I could come up with. I'd assumed that if a creature could talk that it would, and that had led to everything else. It was almost hilariously simple. You took them and made a fucking circus that I'll have to sort out, 24 said, dropping the snarl but still clearly pissed. Seriously? If you're me stripped of everything worth a fuck, I doubt you'll have the creativity to make anything but a bunch of low-rent murder maze garbage, I spat back. The monsters I'd summoned weren't things. Not even Squish, the poor bastard. 24 could fuck right the hell off if she thought I'd hand them over to her tender mercies. Though I guess it wouldn't bother you, since you don't care. It's not like you'd get anything from it, even if you were in control, I added. Is that something that matters? Not being alone, getting something from being a DM? 24 asked. For the first time, she didn't sound angry, which was odd to hear. I think so. I mean, what's the point otherwise? Existence in only the most basic sense? No thanks, I said flatly. 24 is a shitty name. You might as well have called me Reverse 42, 24 pouted. I wondered if the creativity comment had struck a nerve. I was good at making things, not naming them. You do have the orbs for it, but you'd be shiny and white instead of shadow if you were a proper reverse, I countered. She made a pained sound of disgust like I'd landed a particularly atrocious dad joke. I felt a little proud of myself. I was still trying to think of a way out of my present situation, but not coming up with anything actionable. There was the option to ask 24 for ideas, but I discarded it. If she had any, I didn't doubt I'd be floating in the dark alone right now. She'd likely try to fuck me over with her plan even if it required cooperation also occurred to me. My body still hurt, but it was getting better. I only felt about as awful as when I'd coughed up the Boon. Thinking of that, my plan E started forming. I imagined the Boon, with every detail of the crystal I could recall. Nothing happened. I felt a frustrated sense of defeat. One that probably wasn't much different from 24's. 24? You know, instead of thinking of ourselves as original and copy, or old and better version, I think we should just say we're sisters. I mean, we're not that similar, but you know. We kind of are, I offered. I'd called her an incompetent doppelganger. She said she was the not shit version of me. I felt like I was offering a reasonable compromise. Whatever, 24 said without enthusiasm. I took that as a reluctant maybe. It was probably the best I was going to get. This time I didn't simply recall how the Boon looked. No, I remember that Duello gave it to me for services rendered. How it tore and burned coming up. I recall everything about it. A red warning box I couldn't read flashed into being. I ignored it, focusing on the stone. Again, there was strong resistance, but it was in my hands the next moment. I held it tightly to hide its light from 24. It burned to hold it, but I held tight anyway. After recent events, my pain tolerance was not something to be underestimated. You figured something out, didn't you? 24 asked dejectedly. I didn't answer. I don't know if I had or not. I also didn't want to give her an opening to try anything. The Boon continued to burn in my hand, but I didn't know how to activate it. Its encyclopedia entry had been slightly more than useless. Instead of fretting about it, I focused, trying to calm my mind down. I focused on the stone and hoping that Duello would make good somehow because I was screwed as things stood. A desire I couldn't explain started to well up. Duello was a god of communication and I found myself raising the Boon to my face. There was a tearing noise as the pseudo-flesh over where a mouth would be ripped apart. The sound was sickening and wet, but the process was thankfully painless. Where once had been a smooth expanse, jagged flesh revealed a toothy maw. Carried onward by the instinct that controlled me, I placed the Boon into my new mouth. The weight of it rested on my tongue for a moment before my jaw snapped close, shattering it into splinters. The fragments of the Boon choked me even as I tried to swallow. They burned as they dug painfully into my mouth and throat, becoming part of me. Fuck! I hissed aloud. The voice issuing from my new mouth was dry and painful. As if I hadn't spoken in years. 42. Steve's surprised voice sounded in my head. I felt elated despite trying to cope with the sensation of suddenly having a tongue. Help! I said quickly. Hang on, oh, you're in the Steve said before the connection broke. I looked at 24, and she looked at me. I could see something odd and glistening in the light of her orbs. She had a mouth, a sickening collection of two sharp teeth framed by torn flesh. I opened my mouth to speak, then realized I had nothing to say. 24 shrugged as if she understood, and the darkness swam around me. I found myself looking at the aftermath of a battle. In white ichor that glittered gold was written the beautiful one's name. 42, someone asked in concern. I could not remember who they were. Beneath the name written on the plains of eternity laid the being of order clutching its neck to staunch its own bleeding. Black ichor, not its own, covered it and smoked faintly. I laid upon a throne long empty with only the fading radiance of its former occupant to remember them by. Above me was him who had called to me. Love given in haste hung about his neck like a floral noose. Cloaked in dull madness but burning so much brighter within. If the light would be guiding or become as a blade could not be seen. It, sorry. I forgot your perceptions aren't filtered, Steve said. I looked up at him, wondering what the fuck had just happened. I was lying across an office chair while he bent over me and worked at a computer. I couldn't see him any better than last time. He was still a walking void in a robe. Despite that, he looked beat up, and I was pretty sure he was bleeding from knife wounds. Looking around, there was blood in various colors splattered aplenty about the office. Not far from where I laid bonelessly across the chair, a guy in a suit was clutching his neck as it bled profusely. It looked like he'd written something in his own blood on the wall. I wasn't the only one having a fucked up day, it seemed. Chapter 77. Familial Disdain. Time had a strange elastic quality while my brain did its best not to think too hard about what was going on. Steve must have gotten the filter working, as things seemed almost sensible. The office equipment looked like a bizarre eldritch horror chimera and would wink in a flirty way if I looked too long. Obviously, it just needed to be ignored. I didn't really register how I got from laying across an office chair staring dazedly, to elsewhere. I went from the chair to shoved in a fabric basket mail cart and holding some guy's neck together. He was odd-looking, angular like a stylized painting but felt like flesh. "Try not to die, please," I muttered softly. My job was to keep him from bleeding out. Nothing more to it than applying pressure with my tail to the wound. It was strange to actually wield my tail usefully for a change. Fortunately, it worked better than my hands, easily wrapping around and gripping without choking. I found the task much easier to process than pretty much anything else that had happened so far. "Yet, we don't need more ghosts in here," 24 added. I didn't clearly remember Steve rescuing her from the trash bin we'd apparently been shunted into by the system. However, I remember her landing ass first on me when she was tossed in the cart. I gave 24 an appraising look. We did kind of look like ghosts, which meant we already had two present. "Do not make a Christmas Carol joke," 24 growled. "The Patrick Stewart or Muppets version?" I asked innocently. "Why would you even ask? The Muppets, oh fuck you," 24 said, orbs brightening in rage even as she whispered. The guy trying not to die gave a weak groan at that. I felt bad for him, but I had a choice between not acknowledging how fucked up and weird things were and panicking. I felt like he'd prefer the former. When the groan ended in a chuckle, I felt myself smile a little. He was either delirious from blood loss or got the joke. Either way, he seemed all right. The sensation of my mouth moving still surprised me. It was a very new experience still. One that left me feeling oddly self-conscious. I was already a shadow monster. Now I was a toothy one. I did not feel like this would improve my first impressions. 24 was not helping my personal image issues. She was rather taken with her own. She was pressing her tongue out between random threads of flesh. Like a little kid with a missing tooth tonguing the gap. We passed over a bump and were all jostled. I looked up, trying to get a look at Steve despite the coat hastily draped over the top. Unfortunately, ours was not a stylish or secure getaway vehicle. "No. We've got a problem," Steven said, talking at a normal volume. I heard a door close and felt brave. Poking my head up, I peeked out of the cart and found we'd been brought to the room where I'd first met Steve. The office in a void was the same layout-wise, but messy than before. Files and other things were thrown on the ground, and a body took up the desk. Whoever I was looking at didn't appear to be in much better shape than the guy I was holding together. Ignoring the considerable inhumanity, they looked ashen and like they would throw up. Taking in that considerable inhumanity, they had horns, a jaw that looked like it unhinged, and glowing red eyes with black sclera. Sitting next to them on the desk was a bizarrely normal-looking guy. Dead average with an aura like he belonged in a really dull but informative IT video tutorial. He was holding the other one's hand with a gentle expression. "Problem?" Nu asked, looking startled. "Hi," I offered, knowing I was at least part of said problem. I pushed my head up from under the coat so Nu would be able to see me. "Holy shit!" Nu shouted as he scrambled back and fell off the desk. "Dumbass," the one whose hand Nu had been holding said and started laughing. I was surprised by how melodic and feminine the voice was. Then, like a puzzle piece that rotated into place, I realized that I was looking at something female. She threw up a moment later. "I've got you per," Nu said as he scrambled up. Apparently unfazed by being laughed at. "Gross," 24 offered. I wasn't sure if she meant per-vomiting or how Nu had rushed to hold her hair and rub her back comfortingly. I thought it was sweet, personally. 42 needs to go back, now. The system won't let a dungeon remain without a DM for long, Steve said flatly. Nu nodded, then did a double take. You're 42? Nu asked, a smile lighting up his face. Yes. I said, not sure why he seemed so delighted. Let's get you home then. I'd hate for your dungeon to get deleted or reassigned, Nu said. So would I said flatly. I didn't have the spare brain cells to process the absolute terror his cheerful words evoked. Since I would hopefully be leaving quickly, I looked back at the guy I'd been doing makeshift first aid for. He'd already slid his hand up under my tail to take over. I felt bad but let go when he gave me a slight nod. He needed better treatment anyway, but it felt awkward to let go before he got it. Do I need to do anything? I asked, looking back toward Nu. He was holding a tablet next to her, and they were murmuring to each other. We were close enough I felt like I should have been able to hear them. Instead, I felt a kind of vertigo that was unsettlingly familiar. Jagged runes the color of blood issued from pursed lips while soft ones in a pale yellow flowed from Nu's. Some would click in my brain with a pop, like my eardrums had burst. Server, alignment, threshold, but most were just soft static as my head throbbed painfully. It was nice to meet you. I like your work, Nu said. I wasn't sure how much later. The conversation might have taken a minute or an eon. For a DM, you suck far less than average, Per offered. If I could have strung two thoughts together, I'd have replied to them. Instead, I just waved, aping the motion Nu made though I had no idea why he was. Before I could think clearly enough to ask what was happening, everything went white. I floated in a haze before a throne to be judged. I couldn't see a meaningful distinction between the one seated and the chair. I did, however, vaguely recall being called adequate disparagingly. That shouldn't have been an insult. There wasn't anything wrong with being enough. The haze vibrated with mocking laughter. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know who was laughing, and I couldn't speak. Despite that, against reason, I held my middle finger aloft in reply. Better, came the whisper, and everything went black. I think she's a muffled voice said. There was a frantic edge to it, and it was painfully familiar. Hey! I muttered, gazing up into violet. Chris had violet jewels. The thought jolted me fully awake from my daze. Mistress! Black Moor howled. I had a half-second to brace as both hounds jumped on me and lavished me with magma kisses. Wow, I started, wanting to assure them. Instead, I ended up closing my new mouth to keep from getting Frenched. Fuck off! Chris complained, trying ineffectively to push them off. I'm okay guys. Down. I managed to get out finally. Both hounds finally clambered off of me, and I had a moment to breathe. I was still in the bleachers section of the necropolis, but I knew something had happened. My mind was in shambles, but I could still recall 24 and being somewhere strange and meeting Steve again. The details didn't clarify, but I wasn't sure if that was a problem or a blessing. When I tried to sit up, I found myself held down. Chris was unwilling to let me out of his protective clutches. He looked scared, and I patted his arm, not trying to move again. Thanks for catching me, Chris, I said. When my mind had been shredding apart as 24 vied for control, I hadn't recognized Chris. Now though, I didn't have any trouble. When the mirror rippled, everyone looked over. The raid group was returning, Henry in the lead with a bloody sword. I felt confused for a moment at the sight, then checked my clock and security footage. From the moment Henry had left to join the fray to now, about 5 minutes had passed. I didn't know what to make of that and didn't have time to try. There was a clatter of metal and a flash of blue. Henry was kneeling down next to me, holding my hand but not trying to pry me away from Chris. Are you all right? Henry asked. Better now, I offered in reply. It was the best I could do since I still didn't know what had actually happened to me. There was a kind of a relieved sigh from the rest of the Bone Brigade. It was followed by muttered curses and an exchange of chips. These fuckers had been taking bets. I felt absolutely insulted, even as I laughed. I really was home now. Chapter 78. Moving forward. After a few minutes of just lying down, I took a look at my interface properly. Everything seemed intact, which was a relief. At least until I started checking tabs and found a spot with unreadable runes in it. Specifically my alignment. I had no idea what that meant and just filed it under shit to worry about later along with a bunch of other intangibles. 42. Do you wish to return to your chamber? Henry asked me quietly. I realized that lounging on the floor in front of a crowd of my subordinates was a bit undignified. Yeah, that would probably be for the best, I agreed finally. Righting myself, I found I couldn't quite hover like I usually did. I was moving in floaty little bounces instead, which felt really weird and left me unbalanced. Chris immediately had his shoulder under my arm, helping me stay upright. Thanks, Chris, I said, smiling. It still felt weird to have a mouth but nice to make a familiar expression. Henry walked alongside us, looking at Chris curiously but not commenting. I shot him a wry smile, not sure what had gotten into the assassin but not wanting to make him feel self-conscious. Halfway on the trip back, I managed to manifest and maintain legs, which was a more straightforward arrangement than my tail. Once back in my chamber of machinations, Chris dropped me rather unceremoniously on my couch. I was about to ask what the fuck when I noticed how nervous he looked. He was always energetic, but now he was shifting awkwardly in place. After a moment, he bolted for the door without a word. I had absolutely no idea what was going on with him and looked at Henry, who shrugged. Guess he hit his nice limit for the day, I said jokingly. Not unlike Chris, Henry was standing awkwardly and just looking at me now. Want to sit? I've got a mouth now, but I promise I won't bite unless you ask nicely, I said jokingly. You do? How? Henry asked, alarmed. That was not the reaction I'd been going for. Oh. Magic shenanigans mostly. Honestly, I'm not totally sure. I just do, I explained, trying to be more serious. Unfortunately, deflecting with humor didn't seem to be Henry's thing. May I see it? Henry asked. I tilted my head for a moment in confusion. Sure, I replied, then realized I hadn't spoken with my mouth. I was still doing the telepathy thing on instinct, it seemed. Have a look, I added, properly speaking this time. I opened my mouth for inspection and realized something interesting. I had the very uncomfortable feeling that I could stretch it to the point that it would look like an unhinged snake's jaw. A weird ability to have since I didn't eat. Henry sat down, and to my surprise, I could sense it when he touched my face. It wasn't a pronounced feeling, nothing even approaching the level of tactile sensation a human would have, but it was more than I'd had before. A lot more. Gently Henry turned my head a little as he inspected my mouth. He didn't do anything much besides that and checking a few thready spots on my cheek in confusion. He startled then laughed when I poked him with my tongue through one. Your teeth look very sharp, Stalin said approvingly. I jumped, not having heard him or Blackmoor enter the room. But you smell weird. Blackmoor chimed in. Guys, I love you both, but I need some me time. How about you come back in an hour or two? I said, trying to preempt getting dog-piled, literally. The hounds looked at each other before Blackmoor darted forward to give me a lick. Okay. We love you too. Blackmoor bayed as she jumped back. I'd just caught a mouthful of hound tongue and was sputtering. Thankfully, there wasn't a taste to it, but I could feel something, and it wasn't exactly pleasant. Not caring about my reaction, she took off running. She loves you. I respect you, Stalin corrected before he took off too. That left me laughing for a solid half a minute. It bordered on hysterical, but by the time I was done, I felt better. Adorable frickin' murder machines, I muttered as I leaned back into my couch. I could kind of feel it now, which was nice. Chris said he's claimed pick of the litter, Henry offered. He'll have to run that by Stalin and Blackmoor. He certainly should be able to play with any pups if he's nice about it, though, I said and couldn't help a fondly exasperated sigh. I would not aid and abet dog napping of any variety. I'm going to check a couple things, I added as I opened my interface. I checked the security feed first off. It looked like Andrea and Mina were both still alive and holed up in the safe zone. They also looked a bit less repeatedly stabbed than I was expecting. I rolled back through the footage until I found them chugging some really pale-looking potions. Then, curious, I scooped up Reiner and Lillian's gear, careful to leave the clothes, and started digging around. Health potion E grade. Heals minor injuries and symptoms of illness. Oh, shit. I didn't know ones this week were a thing, I said in mild disgust. I pointed out the display information to Henry so he could see. I never encountered potions at all. I have no idea what is or isn't G good, Henry said, sounding more curious than anything. Just for comparison, I showed him the lowest quality potion in my shop. Oh, that one W was T-trash, Henry said in surprise. Well, maybe it's because I pay mana for my stuff. I offered with a shrug. He returned my shrug. I've got a better idea of what common goods are worth now thanks to Alim, but that's it. I'm not sure how much the stuff I've upgraded would be worth if I tried to sell them, I admitted. It wasn't like I actually needed money, but local economics interested me. They would also help me make sure my loot payouts were sufficiently enticing. I didn't know how much some silver, a kind of trash magic sword, and some glowing rocks would really appeal to anyone. I wouldn't know. Chris and I are about 100 years apart, and when we lived, Henry explained. I nodded. That meant Chris would have newer information. Unfortunately, he was from an outright different world and might not have died recently, even in his own. I had no idea how his world stacked against this one-time wise. Fair enough. I'm sure I'll figure something out as I go, I said, not feeling terribly worried. It was an issue, but I needed to sort through what was in front of me for the moment. Let's see what our unworthy hero was sporting weapon-wise, I added. Reiner's sword appeared on my coffee table. It was ornate, but in a garish kind of way, rather than functional but elegant. It also felt kind of oddly familiar. Not like I'd seen it specifically before, but like I'd seen swords like it. Blade of the Harem Master. Ugh, I said as I read the title. If the kid named it that, then I was glad his stupid ass was dead. Blade of the Harem Master. Persona of the Master. The blade will exert a control effect to ensure that its wielder complies with preset constraints and behaviors. Seeking beauty. The blade will continuously seek females of an appropriate level and aesthetic quality to add to the harem. Beautiful submission. When a female target is acquired, a temporary compulsion will be employed. The use of a lily pendant as a spell anchor is needed to ensure they are correctly bound into the harem. Grotesque, Henry offered. I nodded emphatically in agreement. Despite feeling sick after what I'd read, I knew I needed to look at the other item as well. Namely, the spell anchor. Lily pendant. Lady of the Harem. This pendant acts as a spell anchor for the blade of the Harem Master control. Females meeting the spell's criteria and wearing the necklace will submit to the power of the sword. Maidenly virtue, noble young miss. The wearer of this pendant will be endowed with the persona of an Aja-sama. Conflicting character traits will be suppressed. Oh fuck, those poor kids. No wonder why they were so messed up, I said as the implication fully sunk in. The pendants all had different personality tropes for harem members but were the same in function. Then Henry started only to fall silent. Knowing what we did at the time, you did the right thing. Even now, I'm not sure what was or wasn't his own choice, I offered, putting an arm around Henry's shoulders. I'd told him to go for it, and I stood by that. It felt shitty to know the kids might not have had any choice in what they were doing, but hindsight was 20/20. Thank you, 42, Henry said with a desultory chuckle. He picked up my free hand and raised it to his mouth, pressing his teeth to it. It took me a moment to process that the gesture was a kiss.